Christianity. It's a good thing.
The recording's probably going to have a
Yeah. All right. Yes. So the Logan's minute.
You're still going?
Okay, cool.
I don't think you did that.
I think we should be good. Just project.
Do you have a mic that feeds into your camera correctly?
No, I've got one of those glorified task views that has the two mounted points off the or basically so far apart. Yesterday, I no worries.
Okay, we're good. Okay. And we are live. Welcome to the second annual Mentionables conference. My name is John Dunbar. I will be the moderator for the debate between Aron Ra and Tyler Vela. The title is Has Christianity Historically Been in Conflict with Science? The affirmative is going to be Aron Ra, the negative with Tyler Vela. Aron Ra is the regional director of American Atheists, the director of the Phylogeny Explorer Project. He has been involved with the activism since around 2000. He is here again to present the affirmative that Christianity historically has been in conflict with science. The negative is Tyler Vela of the Free Thinker podcast. He started around 2000, mid-2000s. You can check his stuff out at the Free Thinker podcast. And of course, Aron Ra is the original director of American Atheists, director of the Phylogeny Explorer Project. Both their information is available on their respective Facebook pages. Aron Ra does have a book available. It is The Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. It is $20. It's available at the back table. And Tyler Vela also has a book called Measuring McAfee. You can check that out on his website. So we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please note them, and we just ask that you be respectful. All right, guys. The affirmative opening will be for Aron Ra.
Thank you very much. Has Christianity historically been in conflict with science? Has that ever happened? Did a Christian authority ever taught religious lessons that contradicted the scientific consensus even once? Because that's all we need for a yes answer. Of course, the answer is yes over and over again, depending on which field you're talking about. To know that, we need only acknowledge the dozens of children who die in this country every year when their Christian parents deny them medical coverage for treatable illnesses, seeking instead to cure them through prayer, as directed in chapter 5 of the book of James, or the number of snake handlers who die every year refusing medical treatment according to Mark 16. Look at the Christian belief in abstinence-only sex education, endorsed in Texas despite its 98% failure rate, which is how we got the highest percentage of repeat teen pregnancies. Or we can look at another perpetual failure, gay conversion therapy, and neither of these are supported by science, and both are contradicted by it. There are numerous examples of Christianity conflicting with science from every nation and denomination, the strongest example being creationism, where Christians deny everything we know and can prove to be true about evolution, being the one and only scientific theory of biodiversity. The weakest example I have is why Christians typically deny the scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change. The biggest reason being that the Christian fundamentalism has become so infused with the Republican Party as to be almost synonymous, and the GOP is effectively owned and controlled by the fossil fuel industry, which uses the same type bogus science as the cigarette companies did back when they said there was no link between smoking and cancer. This is why the Texas Republican Party platform promises to treat both origins science and climate science as questionable theories to be disputed. And that, of course, misrepresents what a scientific theory is, and that's another way that Christianity conflicts with science. It's not like we both have different theories. Christianity doesn't have a theory at all. To put it in layman's terms, the current concept of a scientific theory is essentially a hypothesis that has been effectively proven in the colloquial sense, and that it has withstood a sustained and substantial battery of tests and critical analysis as part of the peer review process. So evolution, along with the theories of gravity and relativity, as well as cell theory, atomic theory, oxygen theory, and tectonic plate theory, were all hypotheses that have been effectively proven. Not absolutely, which is only possible in mathematics, but by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt, having passed every test put to them and never being contradicted once. Still, American Christians typically won't admit to any of that, which is another reason that Christianity conflicts with science. I don't know what my opponent will say. I didn't look him up, so I don't know where he is on any of this. But covering every possibility that I've seen repeated so often over and over again in prior discussions of this topic, he might bring up a list of Christians who are respected scientists and not only understand and accept evolution, but who endorse it as a verifiable fact of population genetics, fossils, and phylogeny, and who also criticize creationism as factually false. The problem with these examples is that each of them relies on science only partially. Their religious beliefs are irrational, meaning they're not based on evidence or logic, and they will not be reasoned with where that belief is concerned, which is the biggest conflict between reason and religion. I don't know how irrational or conflicted with science my opponent may be personally. If he holds to any of the foundational falsehoods of creationism, he may not want to admit certain truths about evolutionary science, in which case he might list pre-Darwinian Christians who did not accept evolution because they've never heard of it, but nonetheless made valuable contributions to science. One of several examples from the 1700s is Reverend William Smith, a clergyman credited with the discovery of the geologic column, which young Earth creationists today dogmatically deny even exists. The conflict between fact and fantasy is especially obvious with young Earth creationists, who reject not only evolution, but abiogenesis and Big Bang cosmology, as well as plate tectonics, decay rates of radiometric isotopes, geologic stratigraphy, taxonomy, and calculations of the speed of light according to the theory of relativity. Another scientist commonly cited by Christian apologists is Louis Pasteur. He was at least a Lamarckian evolutionist who did not believe in a supernatural creation. He used methodological naturalism to prove the church wrong again when he provided convincing evidence of the germ theory of disease. Until that time, the fathers of Protestant Christianity said that diseases were caused by demons, which is another conflict with science. And while these and many other oft-cited scientists from the Age of Enlightenment were Christians only because they were European, their religion was incidental and irrelevant and did not aid in any of their discoveries, because the Christian religion offers no model that works with either evidence or experiments. No religion does. And not that it matters, because Christian fundamentalists reject most of those discoveries anyway. We typically think of fundamentalists as being the crazy ones and think that moderates are more sane or reasonable by comparison, that the less religious you are, the more reasonable you are, at least according to my experience. And the fundamentalists are the examples of what religion really teaches and believes, and fundamentalists consistently prove my side of this debate. If any faith was a religion of peace or of love, then the extremists of that faith would be the most peaceful, tolerant, and forgiving, and the least judgmental or reactionary people on the planet. They wouldn't care about your sexual orientation, political position, or what you believed. But of course, that's the very opposite of the way things really are. Fundamentalist Christians are the most Christian of all, and they're the most hostile to science. If Christianity was not in conflict with science, then fundamentalist Christians would be the leaders of proper science education in every homeschool program. But we know how much religious extremists are extremely against everything science is or does, both in principle and practice. The fundamentalist defense here is to point out how some creationist denies all these other fields, but he's allowed to believe in electrical theory. So he uses that to invent a heart monitor. And the reason people talk about science and technology is because they're very often different things. Inventing that electronic device didn't require submission to the scientific method. But anti-science apologists brag about that anyway, as if creationism begets good science. But the religious beliefs contributed nothing whatsoever. All creationism does is allow one non-threatening discipline to function as normal while still impeding research in every other field that might challenge one's faith with forbidden knowledge. Fundamentalist Christians even deny scientific methodology because they want supernatural explanations to be accepted as science instead of science. And the problem with that is that a supernatural explanation is essentially the same thing as saying, I can't explain it, so it must be magic. Especially when the words magical and supernatural mean essentially the same thing. How much more conflicted with science can you get? In 1871, Lord Kelvin addressed the British Association for the Advancement of Science, saying, "Science is bound by the everlasting law of honor to face fearlessly every problem that can be fairly presented to it. If a probable solution consistent with the ordinary course of nature can be found, we must not invoke an abnormal act of creative power." The problem is that he didn't carry that far enough. If a probable solution has not been found, you still can't invoke an abnormal act of creative power. Science cannot assume intelligent agency unless we have evidence of it, meaning an objectively verifiable body of facts positively indicating that agent or intelligence. There is no evidence of any kind in any field of study that even implies the possibility of a non-human intelligence orchestrating natural phenomena, nor any mechanism such a being could use to do that. What we have instead are demonstrable properties of emergent complexity, which are completely opposite. Patterns emerging from the bottom up as opposed to being dictated from the top down. These not only occur in nature, but also in virtual reality simulations, which are programs in which evolutionary principles of variation and selection in competitive dynamic environments can, literally thoughtlessly, without any intent or goal, produce diverse and complex incidental designs beyond the capacity of intelligent designers. Yet, Christians deny all of that and assume a God anyway, without any indication or justification, which is a core conflict with science. Lord Kelvin was a devout Christian. He objected to Darwin's theory on religious grounds, promoting intelligent design instead. Kelvin had helped devise the laws of thermodynamics, which modern creationists often try to use against evolution. But Kelvin knew better. He knew he had no evidence or arguments against evolution, and he lamented that Darwin's theory may be bold and visionary, but he admitted it is not unscientific. So how did Kelvin reconcile his faith in science? Through the fallacy of question begging, a circular argument routing back to an erroneously assumed conclusion. He simply imagined that whatever fact he learns about is evidence for God, regardless whatever that fact is or turns out to be. So it isn't evidence at all, and it isn't falsifiable either. If there's no way to know if it's right or show if it's wrong, then it's meaningless, which should apply to religion as well as science. So even Kelvin's otherwise admirable defense of scientific principles still reveals a conflict between his Christianity and the core principle of science. And once upon a time, our ancestors believed that thunder, lightning, and volcanoes were gods in action, that comets were an omen, that the stars and planets had human characteristics, that sickness was a curse of witchcraft, and that epilepsy was demonic possession, all because that's what religion would have us believe. That's what Jesus believed himself, according to the sacred fables, and that alone is enough to prove Christianity's historic conflict with science. But even before we discovered the real explanations for all of these, the supernatural explanations were already wrong. They always have been wrong. There's never been one time when it turned out that a supernatural explanation even might be right. If something is unexplained by science, it doesn't mean that it is explained by magic. You have to show evidence that magic, in this case a god, actually exists, and that there is evidence that it really can do whatever it is. We don't have either one, just a God of the Gaps Fallacy, a combination of other logical fallacies being the arguments from ignorance and incredulity, in addition to question begging, which is a staple throughout religious belief. A logical fallacy is an argument that does not work, either because it includes faulty assumptions or errors in reasoning. You can look up lists of logical fallacies online and read their descriptions, but notice if you do, that every logical fallacy has been used as an argument for God, and every argument for God is a logical fallacy. I'm including William Lane Craig's greatest hits in that as well. In many cases, fundamentalist Christians have also denied the theories of geosphericity and heliocentricity, holding instead to the notion of a geocentric universe, wherein they imagine the entire cosmos rotates around the Earth, and they insist that our tiny planet does not move, according to verses in Isaiah, 1 Chronicles, and a handful of Psalms. If that isn't crazy enough, the flat Earth movement is a religious position too, one dominated by Christians who believe that whatever science can't explain somehow becomes proof of God, which is another example of that same fallacious reasoning. Flat earthers cite a number of verses in the Bible that describe the earth as a flat disk divided into 4 quadrants, sometimes mistranslated as corners, mounted on pillars and covered by a giant crystal dome called the firmament, with windows in it to let the rain in from outer space. The Bible's description of the earth is like that of a snow globe, except that it's reversed, being a glass-walled bubble of air in a vast oceanic abyss. Within the spherical bubble of the firmament is a flat circle, according to Isaiah 40:22, in which St. Augustine described as a disk suspended in the concavity of the heavens, which the Bible describes as the expanse within that giant crystal dome. The firmament is not the atmosphere, as some apologists have tried to argue, because within that expanse we have the sun and moon, and both smaller than the Earth, and the same size as each other, yet both bigger than all the stars. Because the ignorant primitives who made this up didn't understand that the sun was just another star. They didn't know that the sun cannot be made to set at noon, as it says in Amos 8:9, and that neither the sun nor the moon can be stopped in the sky, like it says in Joshua 10. The Bible was written from the perspective of people who had no idea what they were talking about. That's why they imagined that the Earth was the first thing, and the biggest thing, and the center, and the beginning of the universe, as if our planet predates the lights of the heavens, which is just one more verse of many in Genesis that Genesis obviously got wrong. Everything the Bible says about the Earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is wrong, and has been known to be wrong for thousands of years. The Christian scholars have been a bit behind the times about that. St. Augustine said that it was mere conjecture that there might be antipodes, meaning men who walk with their feet opposite ours and the other side of this two-sided coin that he imagined our world to be, according to Scripture. He said there was no reason to believe the fable that people lived on the other side of the world. But he said that 600 years after, Eratosthenes had already shown that the world was round and gauged its circumference. So did Aristarchus. Other ancient Grecian scientists like Pythagoras and Anaxagoras and Aristotle had each followed different lines of evidence to the same conclusion. Yet, even a couple centuries after St. Augustine, St. Procopius of Caesarea also expressed belief in a disk world that the Scriptures depict. He said, "If there be men on the other side of the earth, Christ must have gone there and suffered a second time to save them, and therefore there must have been, as necessary preliminaries to his coming, a duplicate Adam, Eden, serpent, and deluge." So Procopius also imagined a two-sided coin with our world on one side and a mirror image on the flip side. A few more centuries later, the Christian monk and famous artist Hieronymus Bosch was still painting the earth as a flat disk within a transparent crystal ball, even when Columbus was sailing to the New World, proving the scriptural depiction wrong yet again. So Christianity was still promoting belief in a flat earth 1,800 years after science had already repeatedly shown that the earth is a sphere. But if you want even better examples of Christianity historically conflicting with science, there are many. In the early 1500s, Copernicus proposed the idea that the earth was not the center of the universe as the Bible implied. The church condemned his theory as heretical, holding to the literal interpretation that the sun is in heaven and turns around the earth with great speed, and that the earth is very far from heaven and sits motionless at the center of the world. Copernicus had already died in the same year that his theory was published before the church could catch him and kill him for contradicting them. But later that same century, a Dominican monk named Giordano Bruno proposed another heretical hypothesis called cosmic pluralism. The idea that the stars were suns like our own, albeit much further away, and that they might have their own planets and perhaps even life on them. So the church burned him at the stake. And somehow this didn't stop his contemporary, Galileo, the father of modern science, from further promoting heliocentrism with his astronomical observations. The church tried him for heresy too, and forced him to recant, forced him to lie about what he could show to be true, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Consider the Holy Inquisition's words of judgment against Galileo in 1616. The first proposition, that the sun is the center and does not revolve about the earth, is foolish, absurd, false in theology, and heretical because expressly contrary to Holy Scripture. And the second proposition, that the earth is not the center but revolves about the sun, is absurd, false in philosophy, and from a theological point of view at least, opposed to the true faith. But there's no such thing as a true faith. Faith is convincing yourself of things that are not evidently true and then refusing to admit when you're wrong. So the Catholic Church stuck to this ruling until 1992. That's 376 years of Christianity being increasingly conflicted with science on many different fronts. This isn't like when Pope Benedict, also known as Darth Ratzinger, told AIDS-infected Africans that the use of condoms actually spreads the disease. That was Christianity in conflict with science too, but at a time when the Protestants could disavow the Nazi Pope protecting pedophile priests. In the 1600s, however, Catholicism was representative of the Christian collective, and thus these examples of when Christianity definitely was historically conflicted with science cannot be dismissed. Nor can my opponent dismiss the claims made in the Bible. For example, what it says in Genesis 30, that if cattle mate while looking at striped sticks, they'll bear striped calves. Obviously, that conflicts with gene theory. And look what Jesus said in Matthew 8:15 about how you don't have to wash your hands because it doesn't matter what a man takes into his mouth, that it will not defile him. That conflicts with the science of nutrition, toxicology, medicine, and germ theory of disease. Of course, there are plenty of other things that if you put into your mouth, they will defile you too, including alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But what comes out of your mouth, meaning magic words and curses, like Jesus was saying, don't have any effect at all. That's just one more thing Jesus was wrong about. The Bible is full of stuff that contradicts science. The global flood of Noah's Ark conflicts with practically every scientific discipline at once. But even though my opponent cannot say that Christianity has never historically conflicted with science, I suspect that he may try to argue that regardless how any or every group of Christians may have interpreted their badly written scriptures, that somehow Christian doctrine itself doesn't necessarily have to conflict with science, but I will argue that it actually does. Because Christianity is not a philosophy, like some people pretend. It is definitely a religion and is therefore trying to instill a belief regardless what the facts are, whereas science is trying to improve understanding of the facts regardless what we would rather believe. And these polar opposite goals definitely lead to conflicting positions. The only way to improve understanding is to seek out the flaws in your current perception and correct them. You can't do that if you're unable to question the absolute truth of those beliefs, which is the first of many failures of faith. It's not just that Christian belief conflicts with science, but why does it conflict? Because the Christian religion, like all religions, violates all three of the so-called cardinal sins of scientific misconduct. The least significant of the three is plagiarism, presenting someone else's data as your own, which opens up a whole other topic on the formation of Judeo-Christian mythology. More important is falsification, fudging figures to suit your claims or conclusions. We see this all throughout creationist pseudoscience. And even outside of that, too, there's even a respected paleontologist at Cambridge University who was Christian and deliberately misclassifies fossil species to make them conform to his belief in divine design. All seemingly scientific arguments for apologetics are false in one way or another, and they're corrupted by extreme bias, because religion is a bias by definition. But science has rules and practice designed to minimize or eliminate bias by requiring that every postulation be based on prior evidence, and that evidence must be factual, objectively verifiable, not subjective impressions, emotional pleas, or personal revelation, which religion says should be good enough, but it's not. We're not both looking at the same evidence either, despite what many apologists want you to believe. Logically, we can't both claim the same fact as evidence of two different mutually exclusive conclusions at the same time. Because by definition, a fact does not become evidence until it indicates only one available position over any other. Because religion really is all about make-believe, religious people are encouraged to passionately assert their convictions with absolute certainty, shouting indefensible nonsense from the mountain, where science has to be cautious, tentative, and reserved. Because unlike religion, science has to be careful not to get anything wrong. In science, accuracy and accountability are paramount, but religion doesn't even care about those things and will freely assert whatever they want to believe simply because they want to believe it, and that gets us to the worst of the cardinal sins of scientific misconduct, fabrication, where you make up data that can't be substantiated or jump to conclusions that aren't indicated by evidence. Faith is pretending to know what no one even can know. It is dishonest to assert blind, baseless speculation as though it were a matter of fact, yet that's what all religions do. Pardon me? Okay. Citing alleged facts that aren't facts and pretending to know things you don't know are both lies. Religion is a lie. Everything every religion claims is a lie because they're all baseless assumptions asserted as fact. Every religion claims to be the absolute truth, but the truth is what the facts are. So whatever you want to say about your religion is just an empty assertion without those facts to back it up. If you can't verify the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you don't actually know what you merely believe. So when a believer says they know for a fact that God is real, they don't actually know that because they can't confirm it, and it isn't a fact since it can't be verified. Science is only concerned with what is supported by evidence. Whatever is not supported doesn't warrant serious consideration. The only value information can have is however accurate you can show it to be. If we can't show that it's accurate at all, then it has no value at all, and that's already enough to dismiss all religious belief. Science can't just say that anything is possible either, because there are many things that are not. Before we can say whether something is possible, there must be some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. We don't have that for gods or souls or anything supernatural, so there is no reason to believe in those things, as there is literally no possibility they even could be true, and at least some of that is demonstrably false. 59% of Americans agree that science has often conflicted with religion, while 38% say they're mostly compatible. But even if they are mostly compatible, that still means that not always. So 97% of Americans agree that science or the religion and science have historically been in conflict.
Next, we will hear from Tyler Vela for the negative response.
We're going slides. All right. Thank you, Aron. So an argument that seems nearly ubiquitous to any debate between Christians and atheists these days is the idea that science and religion, specifically Christianity in the West, have been gridlocked in an unavoidable and unmitigated battle for truth. And from the advancement of scientific progress and the atheistic perspective, it appears that Christianity has persistently and uniformly filibustered it. This thesis that Christianity and science have been in ideological conflicts and even political, historical, cultural, and often financial conflict goes by the moniker the warfare or the conflict thesis of science and religion. We'll explore this more in a moment, the reason that such a thesis began, but one only needs to think of such a cultural mainstays and popular pundits such as the television series Cosmos.
On switch on the side. Like a well-oiled machine.
Pause time.
It was working yesterday.
That's right. Okay.
All right, resuming time.
All right. Is the cultural mainstays such as the television series Cosmos, both the Sagan's original and deGrasse Tyson's revamp recently, or recent appearances by Bill Nye, the not really historically informed guy, which continually present a rather utopian notion of the shining ideals of unblemished advance of science of objective, empirical, pure science in the face of cold, dark, backward, anti-science Christianity. Built on myths about the creation of the Dark Ages, the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria, Columbus disproving the flat earth, Bruno and Galileo being tortured and executed for their science, that popes have excommunicated a comment or banned human dissection, and more, the conflict theorist advances the idea that Christianity has been in an ongoing struggle to suppress the steady advance of reason over religion, and has had a dampening effect on it. If you've listened to my opponent's debates and his opening statements here, you'll know he makes this exact claim with nearly unabated fervor repeatedly. But on many of these very events that I just listed, he's simply incorrect. Some conflict theorists have even claimed or memed that had religion not opposed science, we would be living on Mars with technology and healthcare far more advanced, by centuries or millennia more advanced, than we have today. You've often seen the slide. Well, what's the problem with this view? The problem is that while it's a tidy story with effective polemical value to the rhetoric of the anti-theist, it's just historical garbage. And that's not my term. That's how professional historian and scholar of science Ed Davis describes it. And this is not because he simply doesn't like it. The problem is that historians of science have known for almost half a century that not only is the overall conflict thesis wrong, but nearly every single event that it tries to hijack to support itself are also wrong. It's a revisionist myth built almost exclusively on revisionist myths. Both the forest and the trees are rotten. It's like putting a bottomless cup into 100 other bottomless cups and expecting it to hold 1,000 cups of water. Stephen Shapin of Harvard describes it this way. In the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion, and to presume that the two bodies of culture must have always been in conflict. However, it is a very long time since these attitudes were held by historians of science. James Joseph Walsh of Fordham University writes, quote, "The story of the supposed opposition of the church and the popes and the ecclesiastical authorities to science and any of its branches is founded entirely on mistaken notions. Most of it is quite imaginary. Only those who know nothing about the history of medicine and science continue to harbor it. As we can see, this is not the opinion of Christians or Christian apologists only. This is not a response given by those at Answers in Genesis or creation.org. This is a fact known and discussed by pretty much every single historian of science writing in the field concerning the history of science and its relationship to religion, publishing by such academic publishers as Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Lyon, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, Yale, and others. There are Christians, Jews, agnostics, secularists, and atheists who all say the same thing. The conflict thesis is a myth, and a particularly absurd one since we know that it's wrong. It's not just an idea that it's wrong. And I have sources for you. In the back, there's actually a 2-page bibliography of all of these scholarly sources. And that's just the books that I have on it. There are hundreds of articles. Now, when the debate is over, ask yourself, which one of us, Ra or myself, has presented the known facts from history and of science based on the best academic literature of the day, and which one of us has merely waxed rhetorical about a conflict that no expert in the field today accepts? I think the outcome will be clear. Now, based on what I've seen from my opponent's prior debate history, Aron may want to construe the debate over if there is a philosophical or theoretical conflict between science and Christianity. But that's not the question of the debate. So we can address that in the Q&A if any of you wish, but that's not the actual what the topic of the debate is. The question before us is about the historical interactions between science and Christianity and the claim that they have historically been in conflict with each other. Now, surely you're thinking to yourself, what is Tyler talking about? We heard it from Aron, Columbus defeating the flat earthers, the Dark Ages, Scope's monkey trials, and so on and so forth. These are all found in our time-honored school textbooks. Texas is there. We've all read these things. How can all of our textbooks be wrong? Well, to the answer to that, let's see where it all began. While the conflict thesis has some roots back to the post-Reformation anti-clericalism, especially in the English-American colonies, it was not until the 19th century that two men solidified it into a single overarching thesis, and would impact almost a century of scholarship after them. These two men were John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White. It was White, more so than Draper, who shaped the landscape of the debate for a century. His book, A History of the Warfare with Science with Theology in Christendom, was standard reading for decades following its publication in 1896. It's well written, it's witty, it's insightful, and it's doggedly footnoted. Everything you'd want in an academic 2-volume tome. The problem is that we know that it simply does not have the benefit of being true. And more often than not, the fire hose effect of footnotes lulls the reader into a false sense of security. And so it was not for several decades that people started checking on the primary source footnotes, only to find that White had frequently skewed the context of events, incorrectly cited sources, attributed quotes to the wrong people, attributed views to people that they didn't hold, and in some cases appeared to invent citations out of whole cloth. Both Draper and White, like many today, make countless anachronisms in their understanding of historical events, including the relevant factors that led to certain historical events. Again, for more on this, the bibliography in the back. Now, let me make one caveat. I'm not actually saying there's never been no conflict. Unlike what Ra says, one exception doesn't prove the rule. No one says that no Christian or church has ever been opposed to any valid or good scientific advances. In fact, no one's even saying that Christians, again, typically Rome and the Inquisition are the bad guys, were right in how they treated the beliefs and writings of the people in these stories. Specifically, I find the suppression of free speech to be wildly problematic in many of the events. The problem is that in nearly every case, it was not a conflict of religious dogma against scientific advancement in virtue of it being something that challenged biblical literalism or faith or something like that. Atheists today typically take the conflict between modern, very American, very evangelical, typically fundamentalistic young earth creationists post the 1970s and their rejection of biological evolution and old earth geology, and filter 2 millennia of intellectual history through that single lens. The issue is that the events of history prior to our context were exceedingly more complex than that, and ironically, What we find is that the church was often on the side of the most evidence-based science accessible known to the day. We might know that they were wrong, but the scientists of their day didn't. So somewhat paradoxically, even when the church was suppressing free speech, something we can all agree was bad, they were doing it to protect the best secular science and scientific theories of the day. I know, it's shocking. At this point, let's zoom in and look at a handful of these events. Let's look at the big ones. The ones you'll find presented by Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson in the series Cosmos, and from Aron's opening talk, the execution of Giordano Bruno, the trial of Galileo Galilei, and Columbus and the Flat Earthers. Now, if the only thing you knew about Bruno was from the Cosmos series, you would think that Bruno was a cosmologist exemplar, that he was way ahead of his time on cosmic expansion, many worlds, and extraterrestrial life, and that he died as the first martyr for science at the hands of the Inquisition for his Copernicanism, with no witness there to defend him. The fact that the Cosmos series gets right is that he died at the hands of the Inquisition. That's about it. Something you should know about Bruno also is that he was someone who denied the historical Jesus. He rejected the Trinity. He believed that the cosmos was one of many worlds or universes, and that there was certainly life on other worlds. Now, some of you atheists might be sitting here today and thinking, well, that sounds pretty good. Not so fast. Bruno was a pantheist. He was a cultic and a mystic. He did not believe in any of those statements based on anything like an empirical science. In fact, he derided the attempts at developing mathematical models of the cosmos like those put forth by Copernicus and Galileo. And the reason he believed that there were other worlds and extraterrestrial life wasn't due to objective science. It was due to his belief in a soulish world spirit that was seeking to balance the hot bodies like the sun with the cold bodies like the planets. They were literally reproducing with each other. His so-called evidences for his heliocentrism had nothing to do with anything remotely like science and everything to do with animistic pagan philosophy about the soulish perfection of orbits, world spirits or souls, and the creative impulse of the fates to continue to propagate, hence his multiple worlds thesis. Bruno's execution at the hands of the Inquisition had nothing to do with his affirmation of Copernicanism, but rather for his anti-Trinitarian cultic pantheism, which was still a wrong thing to do, but it had nothing to do with science. So Bruno, while he may be a tragic victim of suppression of free speech and an obvious abuse of power, it's simply revisionist history to say that he died for his Copernicanism, something that can easily be seen by the fact that numerous Copernicans published and taught completely undisturbed by Rome and in any of the Protestant areas before and after him. Now, speaking of those Copernicans, how about Galileo? Was Galileo tortured by the Inquisition for his advancement of Copernican theories? The church was being dismantled by Galileo and his telescope, and they couldn't have him proving Copernicus right and thus demoting the Earth for being the center of the cosmos, right? We all know that was the problem. Not really. The Galileo affair is long and complex, but let me just say a couple things about it. First, he was never tortured by the Inquisition. In fact, every time Galileo was summoned to the Vatican, he did so under the protection of the Pope and enjoyed the private villa of the Cardinal in Rome. He could have gone and come and go as he pleased. He had a private valet, and he was waited on hand and foot. The idea that Galileo was tortured is just flat out false. Secondly, during his first round of conflict with Rome and his conversations with Cardinal Bellarmino, Galileo was not only permitted to keep researching and studying, but he was encouraged to do so. The only caveat was that he was not permitted to declare geocentrism false, heliocentrism true, or that the Bible favored his view over the church's view. But this wasn't science over religion. Galileo himself believed his view was entirely consonant with the Bible, something that shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with the fourfold allegorical methodology of interpretation. By the way, Rome didn't hold to a literal interpretation at the time. So anyone familiar with that knows that the literal reading, which was one of the most least important readings to them, for they favored the spiritual and the idealistic applications, which were far more important. But they also believed that the literal reading was clearly open to correction and revision as we better understood the material world. Ever since the time of Augustine, the idea that the two books of God, the book of Revelation and the book of nature, should be harmonized. was a ubiquitous concept and stood strong really until the fundamentalist controversy of the mid-20th century. So for Galileo, this was not a religious conflict, or at least he didn't think it should be, and neither did anyone else really. Something else we should remember. Galileo wasn't a modern astronomer. That should be obvious. He's not alive today. It seems so obvious that it should go without saying, but it's vitally important for us to keep in mind. Why? Well, Cardinal Bellarmine was actually 100% on the side of all known mathematical and observational science of their day. We shouldn't be anachronistic and put our view back on him. It would not be until about 2 full centuries following Galileo that any of his predictions would be empirically verified. And even in those cases, they were proven by means very different than what Galileo posited would vindicate them. We are in a position now, looking back on Galileo from the 21st century, where we know that Copernicanism ended up being right, but they didn't. In fact, Galileo's mathematical models were all wrong. We know that they were wrong, and the mathematicians of his day knew that they were wrong. He built them on the idea of perfectly circular orbits, which contradicted some of the major observations that even they were capable of. In fact, the main observation that started to shift the opinion away from geocentrism didn't even come until a full 2 centuries after Galileo. And that was the ability for them to observe what's called the celestial parallax. That is, if something is moving in a roughly circular motion, distant objects should change in their angular relations to it. So if I were to walk in a circle around the room, my angular relation to the door would change. A century later, Newton's inclusion of Galileo's views into his physics started to turn the tide, but the major piece of empirical confirmation for the theory, what Ra requires, didn't come until the celestial parallax 2 centuries later. On top of that, many of Galileo's arguments for heliocentrism were also unconvincing to his contemporaries, and rightly so. They should be. They were bad arguments. His argument from the tides was his main argument. And that argument was that the oceans and the tides move because the earth is sloshing about. In fact, they had better arguments at that time period for the tides. They ended up being wrong also, but they actually better explained the data. Now, to make the whole affair even more complicated, and pardon the jargon, but Galileo was somewhat of a, let's just call him a jerk. He was rude, he was obstinate, he was insulting, even to his supporters and patrons, and ultimately that's what got him in trouble. When Cardinal Barberini became Pope Urban VIII in 1623, Galileo was likely thrilled. A friend of Galileo and a patron for him, Pope Urban personally commissioned Galileo to continue his work in astronomy, and even to explore Copernicanism further. Urban, like pretty much every single college education person at the time, had to take advanced courses in the natural sciences and was by all accounts quite a good amateur astronomer himself. Like Bellarmino, his only condition on the publication of Galileo would produce was that he couldn't teach Copernicanism as true. He could argue for it, he could give evidences for it, he could give criticisms of the Ptolemaic geocentrism of his day, he just couldn't present it as demonstrable fact because there was no evidence for it yet. Galileo was regularly invited to the Vatican, and he and Urban would have lively discussions about Galileo's work. Notice that the Pope was saying, you just can't say what you don't know is true because you have no facts yet. It sounds familiar. Now, after several drafts and revisions, Galileo's publication of the dialogue concerning 2 chief world religions passed the Inquisition publication process and hit the publishers. So his book, Exploring Copernicanism, was approved by the church. So what was the problem? Well, Galileo used a common literary device in the form of a dialogue. He had several characters. One of them represented himself, of course, smart and erudite. But one of them, named Simplicio, or the simpleton, was used as the defending geocentrism. This alone seemed to undermine the spirit of the agreement with Pope Urban, but there was a bigger problem. During his discussions with Pope Urban, Urban had made his own observations concerning the conflict of the 2 theories and why he favored the Ptolemaic system over the Copernican one, and even though he was fascinated by Galileo's work. These observations and thoughts made their way verbatim onto the lips of Simplicio. Now, again, whatever you think of freedom of speech and violations of it and the abuse of power, at the time, it just simply was not a wise idea to publicly and in print insult the Pope. especially when he'd been so favorably disposed towards you. So, Galileo was quickly summoned before the Inquisition and charged with heresy for teaching something that he was expressly commanded not to teach because he had no evidence for it. Many speculate that the trial was really just a show trial. Galileo, again, was never tortured or harmed, and the intent appeared to be to punish the open refusal to comply with Rome, instead to publicly insult the Pope. Such an affront couldn't be permitted, and so Galileo was to be punished. Now, at this time, Galileo was advanced in years. He was basically in poor health and dying. In fact, he petitioned to have the trial in his hometown because he didn't know if he was well enough to make the travel to Rome. He thought he was going to die at any moment. That was denied, but he was brought to Rome anyways, and he was punished to house arrest in his own villa, what he was going to do anyways. So effectively, it's a principled slap on the wrist in a show trial for a friend of the Pope.
5-minute warning.
One more interesting thing about the observation of the whole affair is that between the first run with Bellarmino and a second with Urban, Galileo appeared to have gone into a time of despair, but he was actually invited by several Protestant states to come and continue his work and his publication there, completely unencumbered. They were not opposing science. So we can see that the supposed conflict is far more complex than merely science good, religion bad. Galileo had supporters inside and outside the Catholic Church, and nearly all of his detractors were at the university. But his issue was his penchant for peeing in the lemonade of the very people trying to help him. But let's move on to Columbus. Now this one will be brief. Was the entire medieval church and the Western Christendom backwards and mired in a belief that the earth was flat? Hardly. In fact, not only do we have scarcely anyone in all of Christendom ever proposing that the earth was flat, and a handful that did are relative unknowns and confined almost exclusively to the 5th century early church and then wackos today, but we know for a fact that pretty much everyone, even as far back as the 3rd century before the Common Era, believed that the earth was spherical, that they had even the approximate size of the earth right. They knew the earth was a very large globe. When Columbus came to the royal court to gain funding, he was not coming against a belief in the flat earth. Those who opposed him at the royal court advised Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to refrain from funding him, did so precisely because they knew the earth was big and round. The conflict was that Columbus was proposing the earth was far smaller than they knew it was, and claiming that he could make the trip from Spain around the backside of the globe to the Andes. He thought the distance would only be about 3,000 miles, about 4,000 kilometers, when they knew, and they were right, that it was several times larger than that. They thought the monarchs would be throwing away their money and their sailors on a doomed mission, that they wouldn't fall off the earth, but that they would die of thirst and starvation on the way. And they would have been right had it not been for, well, us, right in the middle. Now, if you read secular historian Ronald Number's book, The Creationists, again, not a Christian, not an apologist, he shows that creationism as we know it today, with its hard objections to evolutionary theory and an insistence on diachronic literal historical reading of Genesis as an account of the material origins, as one of the only readings of Genesis 1, was actually a product of 20th century Seventh-day Adventism in the early 20th century, and it was brought into mainstream evangelical theology in the 1960s and 70s by men such as Henry Morris and the Creation Institute. The conflict we're currently experiencing, which may feel perennial between the evolutionists and the creationists, is, by and large, a product of the mid-20th century and is very American, Protestant, evangelical, mostly independent church movement. The overwhelming majority of Christians worldwide and throughout history simply do not throw blows in this fight. When people like Dawkins and other internet atheists such as Ra present the conflict as a lens by which to view and understand the long and complex, usually positive relationship between science and religion, they're doing something thoroughly anachronistic. Unfortunately, we've allowed the fundamentalists on both sides, among creationists on the right and online atheists on the left, to control the dialogue and tell us what we need to think about it and how we need to ask questions of each other. They want us to see one small rotten tree in the forest being eaten by the pernicious beetle of fundamentalism, and to assume that all the other trees are being ravaged by the same pestilence. The problem is that when we actually look at the trees, they're doing just fine. In fact, I would argue that the long history and dialogue of mutual cooperation, of non-overlapping magisteria, of healthy interaction and sharing of resources, ideas, and goals, of science being motivated and fueled by a religious belief, and theological wonder over the orderliness of nature is a far more accurate and productive way to understand the history of the interaction between science and religion. But why trust the bibliography of scholars when we have read it? Thank you.
All right, thank you. We will go ahead and take a 5-minute break. So it is roughly 10 o'clock, so we will start back up at 10:05 with the affirmative rebuttal by Aron, with a 5-minute affirmative rebuttal by Aron, followed by a negative rebuttal by Tyler, and then the cross-examination is what we get. So we have a 5-minute respite. Thank you, guys. Bathroom back there.
I thought that was you.
It's good to see you.
Good to be seen.
I just want to see my brother because he came up from Temple and I never get to see my family, you know. So they said they were going to be here. And I'm sitting God, I don't know. Can't see him. I don't know you. Except you. I was like, oh, there's Mark.
Last night we had a Q&A and Brad was here and Cassie.
Oh, I don't know.
Me either. Most of them are, I got a lot of those folks were from the Baylor CPA student.
Oh, really?
People came, most of them came to CPA listed.
Yeah, I think everyone's Who's the guy in the corner with the hair and the leather jacket? Who's the guy in the one shirt with the hat?
Well, he's one of the speakers. They'll be talking about it this afternoon.
My brother did a podcast with him. He and my brother did a podcast. I'm like, all these guys are podcast people. And they're all like,
I saw somebody make a comment. I was like, yeah, George, my sisters do the books there. And I was like,
hi, how are you?
All right, how you doing? Is there anything to drink nearby? Some water or something? Or?
we have some water.
Oh, okay. Thanks. How's the YouTube doing?
Good. Discussion.
Yeah. We got nothing on. You can't keep service on Facebook.
I've been a little worried, but it's.
Yeah. It's,
Hey, John. Your mic wasn't on a while ago.
Yeah, I had it on.
Okay.
I've been screaming and yelling at my...
When you're not doing anything, I turn down.
Okay, cool. Alright, so the box over there says I deserve a donut, but I didn't get a donut.
Sorry.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, we will start with our affirmative rebuttal by Aron for 5 minutes. Whenever you're ready, sir. Aron.
Mr. Vela did not properly address most of my arguments, like what the Bible said about what Jesus believed. Mr. Vela didn't adequately refute even the few points he tried to address either. Instead, he largely attacked arguments I didn't make. I've never been on Reddit, and the reason I don't subscribe to the conflict thesis is because it assumes that the conflict is never ending and on all topics. The question being debated today is not whether science and religion are always in conflict. The question is whether they have historically ever been in conflict, which my opponent has already conceded, so I win. But in the time remaining, I too have a list of scientists who have rationalized how they can accept evolution and still believe in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that science and religion are compatible. They're using two different philosophies with different sets of rules, and the science is only acceptable as long as it doesn't present a challenge to one's faith. The moment it does, there's a problem. Then the science will be rejected because it is forbidden to doubt your religion. Wherever that boundary is differs according to how well the believer can rationalize whether accepting this or that concept will cause them to question their faith. While they reasonably and rationally understand exactly why every aspect of science must be objectively indicated, vindicated, verified, falsified, and discarded or corrected if they fail, the faithful can't and won't do that to their religious beliefs. Those are sacred and off limits. Religious beliefs are assumed in honor of authority or as a result of emotional or cultural conditioning. They are never based on empirical evidence, and believers are determined never to change their minds despite all evidence to the contrary. Remember what the Jewish God said in Deuteronomy 6:16 and what the Christian God repeated in Matthew 4:7, "Thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test." That's why they made up the story about that one skeptic, Thomas. "Because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet have believed." So you're encouraged to believe without evidence. You're expected to accept that Thomas saw evidence, so you don't need to. Because Christianity depends on a lot of irrational, illogical gullibility, where you're supposed to believe what you're told without question, without reservation, and without reason. But even when the Bible says you should reason with your neighbor, it means to refer to the unquestionable scriptural authority rather than testable scientific evidence. Remember, your salvation is based solely on whether you believe. It has nothing to do with whether you're good or bad. Gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. So Christianity never promotes critical analytical skepticism. Instead, it says you'll be damned if you dare to question the existence or identity of your tribal God. In fact, disbelief is the one sin the Abrahamic God is unable to forgive, which is another clue that it's all made up. Because if any God really existed, he wouldn't need the most dubious representatives imaginable pleading with us to believe impossible nonsense for no good reason and threatening us if we don't believe their pathetically weak arguments and indefensible assumptions. The very requirement of faith puts Christianity in conflict with science. It should be that every belief is scientifically supported, and any belief that requires faith should be rejected for that reason.
Okay. What you've actually heard as an atheist, ironically, tell us what God would be like. That would be like me saying, "I've never met your wife. Let me tell you what she is like." It makes no sense. The opening talk by Ra was effectively what's called the Gish-Gallup fallacy, which is drinking from a fire hose. It's a shotgun overloading of claims that meant that they're expected to respond to every single one of them. The problem is that a shotgun approach of simplistic claims can't always be adequately responded to by more simplistic claims. It's very easy for me to make one short statement that needs to actually to be unpacked. It's very easy for me to say, oh, Galileo was killed for his Copernicanism. But for me to actually go through and say, okay, well, let's look at the history of what actually happened, it's going to take far longer. Now, memes and assertions are not actually arguments. Notice that he says that Christianity cannot be reasonable because science is good, and if we presuppose that science is the contradiction of reason, then look, science is the contradiction of religion, then look, science is against religion. Well, that's just question begging. It's trying to win by definitional fiat, by saying things like, well, faith is just believing the things that you know ain't so. That's just not what faith is. That's, again, not how we define what faith is. That's the atheist saying, let me define for you what your view is. Look, if we define it this way such that your view is false, then surprise, surprise, your view is false. Again, that's simply question begging. That's just not what biblical faith is. Faith, on the biblical view, is not anything we've heard today. It's not an act of the intellect. It's not actually a belief. It's an act of volition. It's an act of trust. And this has been shown over and over again. Now, the same thing happens with the treatment of the Bible. If we assume that the Bible is false, that God doesn't exist, and we do all these kinds of things, then we can offer a failed internal critique, which is basically, hey, this is all bad, because if we assume that it's all bad, then look how bad it all is. There's a conceptual failure on the heart of the main argument that he makes, however, which is a conceptual failure to disambiguate. He fails to disambiguate Christians from Christianity. In fact, he said if he can only find one example, he wins. That's not actually correct. If he can find one example of a Christian doing one bad thing, that doesn't mean that Christianity is bad. So, for example, a contradiction is that X contradicts Y only if X entails not X. Now, if I can show that one instance of X doesn't actually contradict Y, then the claim is false. It's not actually a contradiction. That's just how logic works. Effectively, it means that if you have one wrong view, if we were to follow his argument, in any field, so if at any time, in any scientific field, you have one wrong view about science that you defend, therefore, you're anti-science. And every single person that shares your view and your entire worldview are all wrong as well. And that they're not only wrong, they are anti that field of inquiry. Again, that's just not how logic and reason work, folks. Science uses a different philosophy, he claims, than religion. Well, guess what? It also uses a different philosophy than ethics, aesthetics, economics, literary theory, text criticism, political science, and on and on and on. But does that mean all those things are anti-science? Of course not. They're different realms of inquiry. They're different ways that we talk about the world and understand different aspects of the world. The way that I understand the rotation of the earth around the sun is going to be very different than I understand how Hannibal brought elephants over the pass in history in the ancient world. It's going to be very, very different. So, at the end of the day, the question is, what was actually sustained? That Christianity, qua Christianity in its own essence and doctrine, is contrary to science, without assuming that is the case already, or whether or not one individual disagreeing with one aspect of science is enough to demonstrate that Christianity qua Christianity is contrary to science.
All right. We will now begin our 20-minute cross-exam of the positive by Tyler Vela.
All right. Is this on?
Yeah.
Is it on? Okay. So my first question is, you made a couple things. So is it the case that a piece of evidence is only a fact if it demonstrates one theory?
In science, yes.
Is it possible that a piece of data can support multiple different interpretations of it?
Yes, we call those facts, not
Okay.
evidence.
Okay, so a fact can support multiple different theories.
You can have the same fact be true in two different mutually exclusive conclusions. Then it's not evidence, it's just a fact. It doesn't become evidence until it indicates one over the other.
So something is a fact before it's evidence.
Right.
Okay.
Evidence is a body of facts.
So can they ever support contrary theories?
How could it? How could you use the same fact and call it evidence of two different mutually exclusive. It can't select one over the other if it's equally selecting both.
Okay.
That's logically invalid.
Could a cosmological constant be demonstrated and possible on both a steady-state theory and a rapid expansion theory?
I don't even want to get into cosmology. It's well above my pay grade, as I think I've heard a number of people say today. So I don't want to speak about that because I understand that you need a different kind of physics for some levels of cosmology, so I'm not even going to go there.
Okay, I'm simply asking if the one piece of evidence can be used for conflicting different theories.
Only, so far as I know, it only is possible in history. Historians will use the same fact as evidence of two different hypotheses, but it apparently only works in history, doesn't work in science.
Okay. You said things like Jesus, you make claims about Jesus' view, such as purification. What comes into the mouth is not defiling, but what comes out of the mouth is defiling. I'd like to ask about your interpretation of that passage and why you think that something that is defiling is the same thing as something that's unhealthy.
Well, according to the Bible, Jesus believed in demons. He was a faith healer, which is essentially no different than the faith healers we have now.
That was my question. So you said that he made the claim that whatever, it's not what comes in the mouth that's defiling. And you said, well, that's ridiculous because we can put all kinds of things in our mouth like a gun that is unhealthy for us. So I'm asking you, what is the relationship between defiling and why do you think that means that it's unhealthy?
Because he believed in magic words and curses.
So therefore you made the conflation between those two concepts?
That's the way I interpret it, yes.
Okay. Do you think that you have a certain bias against that causes you to give such an unfavorable interpretation?
What bias could I have?
That Jesus, like you just said, that he was a faith healer and therefore he was insane.
Was that my first impression when I was a Christian?
No idea.
Okay, well, obviously when I was a Christian, I didn't have that impression.
Okay.
I had to do some study on it before I realized that, oh, that's what it is. That's the way he is. I mean, I know a lot of Christians that people who have brought to me, that they don't believe in the Bible necessarily, but they like Jesus, and I thought, well, why do you like Jesus? Well, Jesus said nice things. Well, when? Where? Show me. Because it took a while for me to realize that Jesus wasn't a great guy. He tells people to do a lot of stupid stuff, and people shouldn't have listened to him then. I can understand why. They said that familiarity breeds contempt. So this is why Jesus gets no respect in his own hometown, because I go, who are you? You're the carpenter's son. You're a fool. What are you doing? Healing people. And he didn't actually heal anybody. He was a faith healer. The whole thing was a scam.
Do you have any evidence for that?
The story.
Do you have any empirical evidence for that?
Only the story says so.
So the story says that he was a scam?
Yeah.
Can you show me the passage?
Yeah, how about where he didn't really heal the blind guy, but the way the rubbing, I mean, any of his supposed miracles, especially in the healing thing, this is what faith healers do. This does not work. And even in the story, in one case, it didn't work.
You're making the claim that we can't believe anything unless there's empirical evidence. You've now made multiple claims, and I'm asking you, do you have empirical evidence?
Yes, I have. The story says this is what happens. You're asking me my evidence of the story saying, yeah, the story says that. So we can crack open the book and show you the empirical evidence that the story says that.
Could you show me the citation where it says that Jesus was scamming people on faith healing?
It describes what faith healers do.
So do you believe it based
that
on,
do not work?
Do you believe it based on a biased interpretation or based on empirical fact?
Based on empirical fact.
What's the empirical fact?
We know that this kind of healing does not work. That it is exclusively fraudulent. Faith healers do it all the time. They have done it all the time. It's always been fraudulent.
So you're making a guilt by association fallacy.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
It is always fraudulent.
So
there is not a faith healer. There is not a true faith healer anywhere in the world. There never has been.
But you don't have any actual empirical evidence for the direct claim you're making about Jesus in history.
Yeah, except that the book actually says this is what he's doing. And even in the case when he didn't actually heal anybody, oh yeah, I just talked about what the story says. The empirical evidence, the story says that.
It says that he was a scam.
It describes what a faith healer is.
It doesn't describe it.
So it describes, is he a faith healer?
So let's keep
Is he a
going.
faith healer?
He does heal by faith, yes.
So he's a faith healer.
Well, no, because you're going to use a biased interpretation of what that actually means. While I agree with you, actually, generally.
Is that according to a bias?
It is.
Or is it because the book says so, and it's explicit?
It doesn't explicitly say that. All right, moving on. You also claimed that it was plagiarism from its formation of theology. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, if Jesus is a combination of multiple other characters. I mean, I remember Dionysus was reading one of the early works about Dionysus, and it wasn't even into the anti-apologetics thing yet, when I realized that Dionysus is making all the same claims that Jesus would make. I am the vine, I am the fruit of the vine, and so forth. And then I realized that, he didn't do the Penn and Teller trick where you pour water into the jug and then pour out wine. He turned water into wine in a much more spectacular way. He had the springs of the earth spring forth wine. Now that's a tough trick. Even Penn and Teller couldn't do that one. So it occurred to me that why would God create his prophet, his son, whatever, to be a sequel to a human idea that had already been so many times repeated? So either Dionysus really could turn water into wine, or Jesus really couldn't do it either.
Do you know the date of the composition for the text about Dionysus?
I want to say it's about 430 by Aeschylus, I think.
No. So do you have any other information on?
I would say 430 BC.
Also incorrect. Do you have any
What is it?
information about most of our sources dealing with Dionysus are medieval sources. They trace back to the Gnostic period following Christ, actually. So they're actually anti-dating Christ.
Okay, well, the attribution when you look it up is 430 or 530 something.
Well, 430 and 530 is the attribution of when the myth was supposedly around. All of our references to it are actually far later. We have no sources to it prior to the time of Christ. So plagiarism. The empirical evidence is all anti-dating of the time of Christ. So if you want to go with empirical evidence, we should go with empirical evidence.
So like with Krishna?
So great, let's go with Krishna. Do you have claims about Krishna?
In the Mahabharata, describes Krishna giving sight to the blind.
Do you have any sources for these
The
materials?
Mahabharata.
Okay. Do you have any academic sources for the translation and interpretation of these passages?
No, I don't.
Okay. You also said that there is a fudging of evidence that deals mostly with the creationists. Outside of creationists, because as I've shown in my speech, Ronald Number shows that creationist is a late 20th century really invention of the SDA. It's not actually essential to Christianity. Do you have any evidence of fudging of evidence by outside of your creationist claims?
Not off the top of my head. I know there's some back there in my memory, but I wasn't thinking about that.
Okay.
I do want to mention that where you went on about Galileo and all that. And
Well, you'll have time for your cross-examination efforts. So you also mentioned Augustine and the antipodes. You thought that the antipodes were a description of other people on the other side of a flat Earth.
because that's what he said.
Okay. Are you aware that the antipodes, the idea of the antipodes, was actually a subterranean, the idea of a subterranean people group? It wasn't actually dealing with the spherical world. It was dealing with literally on the other side of the ground that we're standing on.
Well, you did say that it was on the other side of the world.
It's the other side of the ground that we're standing on.
Yeah, and that their feet would walk opposite ours, yes.
Yeah, so dealing with the historical context when we're talking about the antipodes, we're talking about a subterranean people walking literally upside down on the other side of the earth, of the ground that we're standing on, not on the other side of the spherical
Well, it's still
globe.
the same thing though, because if you have the flat disk and it's mounted on columns, then that is the only interpretation you could have. If there's going to be another side of that flat disk, it would have to be that.
Do you have any,
And that's why.
do you have any sources that they believed in a flat earth at this time period?
Yeah, they said so.
So no, actually, everyone knew the flat earth. We have almost no references to a flat earth.
Well,
at this time.
St. Augustine, who you said was obscure, some obscure, I don't think St.
No, I didn't say Augustine was obscure.
You said that anybody that referenced the flat earth was some obscure person. Well, I don't think St. Augustine of Hippo was an obscure
Right,
person.
but your claim requires, you're saying it requires him to believe in a flat earth, to believe in these antipodes, that's on a flat earth. And I said, well, in the historical context, we understand what they're talking about the antipodes. They were actually, in that context, speaking about people
And
walking
in the same paragraph.
on the flat underside of the actual ground, not on the other side of the globe we're talking about. And you're saying, basically, well, he believed in a flat earth, therefore that's what that means, therefore it means that it's a flat earth. It's a circular argument. You have to assume flat earth to have him mean flat earth.
And
But
he's
really,
arguing-
he's responding to the antipode idea.
In the same paragraph, he's arguing whether the world is round, if it should prove to be. So he's being speculative.
And he's actually arguing against it if you read the entire context. He later goes on to then say, look, we also shouldn't believe anything. We shouldn't argue against the scientists lest any of what we say should be wrong. He actually gives almost what skeptics today define as their skepticism. He basically says, look, we shouldn't tie any of our stuff to this because if it takes a turn of a shovel to overturn our ideas, we shouldn't make these ideas part of what the Christian faith is. He directly makes that distinction.
And he also says if the world should be round, and then he has no reason to believe that.
Okay. Do you have the
And then
citation?
Caesarius does it again centuries later.
Do you have the citation for those?
I do,
Okay, you can do this later.
I think, but it'll take me a moment to look for it.
No, you can get to it later. We don't even take more time. You said faith is definitionally the pretending what you know isn't to be so. What dictionary definition is that from?
Well, I take my definitions mostly from scripture. So Hebrews 1:11, the evidence of things not seen. We walk by faith, not by sight. And so, but in every reference to Scripture, and I have extensive citations for this one, not just everything the Bible says, but about faith, but also hymns and sermons of theologians past and present. I've got a lot of resources on that one.
Well, given your understanding of that defiling equals unhealthy, I'm gonna abstain from thinking you have proper hermeneutics of these things.
Well, I can demonstrate that.
And I can demonstrate the opposite. You
I
can ask me
bet
across,
you
you can ask
can't,
me in cross
But that'll be a different debate.
Yeah, that would be different. But effectively, you're not actually using the biblical notion as we would define it.
In what way am I not? I have the verification. I have all the sources I need. And every scriptural reference, not just from the Bible, but from other scriptures as well.
But if you handle it in the same way that you're handling that Jesus saying defiling, which was a religious concept, not a health concept, is equal to unhealthy, and that it only is what comes out of the mouth, which is what you also claim was curses rather than foul language. I'm just going to say that I think your bias leads.
Well, then what fallacy are you committing now? You're assuming that if I got that wrong, then I'm going to get this other thing wrong too.
No, I'm saying.
But I'm not. I'm
saying,
definitely not going to be. Even if I were to concede the point you want to make about me getting wrong about your interpretation of defiling, grant that. I'm not wrong about this.
Okay.
I can prove this.
Oh, great.
I'm using the right definition,
Then
and
we
you're
can
not.
Okay, it's good to know that you have the right definition of what I believe. Now, why would Christianity need to have a proper theory of tectonics?
If it's going to be epistemology at all, it should have that. Because it is dishonest to assert as fact what is not evidently true.
Of tectonics specifically. So every epistemology has a theory of tectonics? Every valid epistemology has a theory of tectonics? I asked why Christianity.
Why would there have to be?
Why does Christianity, qua Christianity as a religious belief, need to have a theory of tectonics?
Why are you isolating Christianity? Any religious belief. So we have the basic distinction is science versus faith, right? So Hindus and Muslims and Christians all in the faith category. So they're all going to believe whatever they want to believe because their storybook says to believe that. And they're going to go to hell if they don't believe that. And then we have science that follows an entirely different methodology, that actually has a methodology that works. Okay.
That doesn't answer my question. Why would Christianity need a theory of tectonics?
The question doesn't make any sense for the reason I just explained.
I know that it doesn't make any sense because the claim doesn't make sense that Christianity would need a theory of tectonics. It'd be like asking, why does literary theory need a theory of tectonics?
Your question demonstrates your misunderstanding of my position. That's why the question doesn't make sense.
Does economics need a theory of tectonics?
No.
Okay, good.
Making the question stupider does not help your case.
Well, it actually does, because if Christianity is not making claims about those types of things, it's a different field of inquiry altogether, it's a different type of thing, we shouldn't expect it to need a theory of tectonics. So to say that Christianity is problematic because it doesn't have a theory of tectonics, because it's about heaven and hell and celestial things.
But that's not, of course, what I said. I mean, you criticize me for not having met your God. You haven't met your God either. That's the problem. One group is making assertions of things that are not demonstrably true, that are not evidently true, they're not verifiable at all. They're empty. They are what we call in the South talking out of your ass. And then science has stuff we can show is really real. All beliefs should be based on science, all of them. No belief should be based on faith because faith is the most dishonest position it is possible to have.
Okay. Do you have empirical scientific evidence for the belief that all beliefs should be based on scientifically empirical evidence?
Do I have empirical?
Do you have empirical scientific evidence? If you could cite a lab report, that'd be great. For the belief that
Can I cite a lab report that having verifiable accuracy is better than not having it? Yeah, I think I can do that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. No, not that it's better. That in order that
that one works and one doesn't? No, yeah, I can do that.
That you have the principle, the philosophical principle of logical positivism, which is...
Why would it be logical positivism?
Because your scientism just is logical positivism, neo-logical positivism. So you're making the claim that we should only believe the things that we have empirical evidence for. Can you give me empirical evidence demonstrably tied to we should only believe the things that we have empirical evidence for?
Yes.
Or is that a philosophical belief?
No, that's demonstrable. We can do an experiment on it now. We can see how much prayer works and how much science works.
Well, no, that would be an empirical evidence for whether or not prayer works or doesn't work. That wouldn't actually be empirical proof for the philosophical.
Or how about the accuracy of faith then? You know, we have one source for your religion. And then shortly thereafter, we have 30,000 different denominations.
Great.
So obviously, everybody's sharding off in different directions. Nobody's getting more accurate.
Okay, that would, again, if there's a scientific claim for empirical evidence, it would be about that claim. I'm asking about the specific claim. You're making a claim. There's a set of things we should only believe the things in that bucket that have empirical evidence.
And we should only,
You're making a claim about that bucket. I'm asking you, is the claim itself in that bucket?
Is the claim itself,
Do you have empirical evidence for the claim that we need empirical evidence to be rational?
rational is by definition, that you base your beliefs on reason and logic
Do you-
and evidence.
Rational is by definition that you believe it based on empirical evidence?
I didn't say always empirical, I said by reason, by logic, and by evidence.
So we can believe things by reason and logic that we don't have empirical evidence for.
Yeah, if you have logic.
Great, okay, so we agree. Are you aware of what concordism is?
No.
Concordism is the idea that whatever the Bible states, whether it affirms it or not, we have to draw our scientific understanding from that. Must a Christian be a concordist?
My position was that faith is misleading and should be abandoned. That faith is a dishonest position, that it is not a path to truth. So instead of believing, like actively believing things, you should be abstained from belief until the evidence compels you to believe. You should be tentative even in your belief.
That wasn't my question. But I'll move on. What evidence would you allow for the falsification of your atheism? Or
Anything that
the
qualifies
position
as
of
evidence.
What type of evidence would qualify?
As I said before, objectively verifiable facts that are either positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with that position over any other.
If there was a manifestation, if you said, God, show yourself to me right now, there's a manifestation of a celestial being, we all observed it, would that be evidence of some type of divine realm to you or not?
It's objectively verifiable, factual.
We all share the same evidence.
Exactly.
Why would you not give a naturalistic explanation of, well, we all hallucinated, well,
that's possible too. That's why I said you should be tentative and not believe anything until you're compelled to.
Okay, so is there any evidence that you couldn't give what you would think would be a more possible or plausible naturalistic explanation for?
Is there any, give the question again.
Is there any type of empirical evidence that could be given that you wouldn't say there is a more plausible or possible naturalistic explanation for, such as hallucination, delusion, pattern-forming material, or the online favorite, it's more humble to say, I don't know, and so therefore I'm going to reserve belief?
Well, as I said several times, that I would reserve belief until the evidence compels me. So I will entertain any possibility as long as it is possible.
Right. So if we could find that stamped on every single atom, Yahweh made this, rather than saying, well, that's evidence for the existence of God, you would say, well, I'm going to reserve belief because the evidence doesn't compel me, because it could be my mind is a pattern-forming thing, I could be deluded, we could all be hallucinating, it could be aliens. So is there actually any evidence that you think would be compelling for the existence of God?
Yes, as I already gave it in my presentation and again here, but I'll give it again. If magic were real, there would be people who could demonstrate that.
Well, I don't believe in magic.
Well, yeah, you do. The supernatural magic, I mean, if you believe in blessings, that's a magical enchantment, and the curses are, of course, the negative version of a magical enchantment. So yeah, Adam was created as a golem spell, so yeah, there's spells and curses and enchantments. Yeah, you believe in magic. It's the supernatural. That's what it is. So if the supernatural / magic for everybody else, if that existed, there would be people who could manipulate, people who could demonstrate that. You wouldn't have absolutely every single faith healer be a fraud. There would be faith healers in hospitals, successfully.
But if that was the case, why would you not just give a natural explanation that there is some type of causal relationship that we're not aware of?
Because then we would have an objective verification that there is at least a thing there, even if we can't explain it. You have to show there's a there.
Cool. Give me 1 second. All right. Aron, your cross-examination, time will begin when you begin.
Okay. To me, being in conflict means being incompatible. So my questions will attempt to find some aspect of Christianity that is compatible with science, meaning that it conforms to those principles. What empirical scientific evidence has ever led you or anyone else to believe in Christianity, and therefore should also convince me? Turning around your same question.
I'm not an empiricist, so I don't actually think that empirical evidence is what's required or even needed within that realm. However, I can easily answer what would falsify my belief. What would falsify my belief is something like the ability of naturalism or atheism, and I was an atheist for 20 years, the ability of naturalism or atheism or any type of materialism to account for the existence of things such as the laws of logic, objective morality, the existence of something from nothing, the fine-tuning of the cosmos, specified complexity, where God functions not only as a simple explanation for all of these types of things. It's not a God of the gaps. I'm not simply saying we don't know, therefore God. I'm saying these types of things, 100% in analogous situations, we infer mind behind. So when we get one of these, it's still proper to infer mind. It's still reasonable to abductively do that. And when we multiply and we say, okay, well, we can have the same abductive explanation for a whole host of things. Not only do we have a simple explanation, but because we only have one thing, I don't need to require multiple explanations for them. But I also have high degrees of explanatory scope that explains a large amount of the data without needing to go to other theories. This is something that is useful in science as well. We prefer one theory that can unify lots of questions. And it's not ad hoc. So I'm not actually altering the theory in order to fit the data. We have already a pre-existing explanation. As it is, without altering it, it still accounts for all these other things. So if naturalism or atheism could provide even a meaningful alternative to those questions, then I would easily disavow my belief.
Okay, well, see, I have a number of problems with that, because one, it can answer all of those individual things with an actual explanation where you don't have one. But the other problem, the bigger problem, is that you think that it not having that explanation is somehow indicative of God, or you're not going to overturn the God thing unless naturalism can explain this without a God. But God isn't an explanation anyway. It is a God of the gaps. I know you said it isn't, but it is.
Is there a question coming?
All right, so what scientific experiments could we perform, or that have ever been performed, to test the veracity of Christian belief in whole or in part?
I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, because again, you may be debating me as if I'm a typical creationist or a concordist. I'm just not. So I'm not sure what type of empirical evidence or scientific experiment could be performed on something that is not an empirical or scientific question. Again, that would go back to my question of what economic experiment can be done to prove evolution. It's just, you're just in the wrong categories.
Okay, well, I think we've addressed that well enough. Just as we should not declare anything to be the truth unless we can show the truth of it, we should also be able to winnow the wheat from the chaff, to separate fact from falsity. All hypotheses must be potentially falsifiable, so what scientific evidence or experiments could disprove your religion?
I believe that I already answered that. If you
Well,
mean
scientific experiments, you said you were looking for scientific explanations. You want to put the burden of proof on naturalism. You don't have a burden of proof. You've got God did it, which is, I don't know how it happened, therefore magic. That it literally is the God of the gaps. That is your position.
it's not.
I know you don't identify it as that. I identify it as that. That's what I hear when you say, science can't explain this, therefore God. That literally is the God of the gaps fallacy.
But that's not my claim. And saying, well, I know that you don't mean that, but that's what I hear when you mean that. I mean, I can say that I hear you saying that you hate God, you love your sin, and that you want to suppress the truth and righteousness. That's not what you mean.
Well, of course, if I loved sin, I'd be a Christian.
Well, no, you
Because then I could be protected to just do whatever I want. I could be forgiven for it. You want to bring up your objective morality?
But my point is, in answer to your question is, just because you don't want to actually understand what I'm saying and you want to hear something different.
I don't. It's not that I don't want to understand you. That's never the case.
Okay. If I say that's not what I mean, you say, well, it is what you mean, and that's what I hear when you mean. Then what you're saying is, I don't actually want to. If I'm saying that's not what I mean, there's a misunderstanding here. Now, instead of just saying, well, okay, then genuinely, I'm sorry I misunderstand you. Let me help understand you. If you say, well, no, that is what you mean, and that's what I hear when you say that's what you mean. That's not actually genuine.
Well, then clarify. How is it not?
Okay. So a God of the gap says it's an argument based on ignorance. It says this thing exists. There's paper on the desk. I have no idea why there's paper on the desk. I have no information about it. Therefore, it must be God. It's just an appeal to mystery. The arguments that I would give, for example, God needs to exist in order for, let's just say, specified complexity to exist. Because in every analogous case that we find something that has specificity and complexity, that is statistically variable, that is information giving to the degree that it is not simply information that could be done by simple repetition, for example, so color patterns, crystals, things like that, that specified information-specific information data, 100% of the time, in every single analogous case, we infer design, we infer intelligence. There is no case other than specified complexity and genetic information where we say, you know what, there's specified information, there's more than just a repeated pattern, it's actually giving information that is structural. Every single case that we do, this is what SETI does. SETI sends out certain information into the universe because we expect if we get something back that is not that has a certain amount of information, that has a certain amount of complexity, that's statistically anomalous from simple repetition pattern in nature, there must be mind behind it. Now we don't look at SETI and be like, oh well, it's aliens of the gaps. We look at them and say, no, you would be inferring intelligence based on observable things that we know in every analogous case. So if I come along and say, okay, well we have genetic information. Now, I'm not anti-evolution. It might very well come about by an evolutionary process. However, in every single case where we have specified information that is statistically variable, that gives information that is determinative, we always infer intelligence. Now you might say that might not be the best explanation, but to say that it's simply God of the gaps, we don't know, therefore God.
Can you give me an example relative to the various
sure.
categories you just brought up?
Yeah, so if we walk outside and I see a hillside and there's erosion and everything, or if we look at a cloud and I see a pattern and I say, it kind of looks like a dragon. There's nothing about the cloud that is statistically variable, that displays a complex information, or anything like that. However, if I go outside and I see Mount Rushmore, or a cloud, or on a mountainside, I don't infer erosion, I infer mind. If I see writing in the sky that conveys information through text, I don't say, oh, what a wonderful cloud pattern. I just have a design-seeking mind, and I see the word, Julie, will you marry me? We rightly infer mind when we see that type of information.
Okay, and once again, I repeat the same question. Can you give me an example from your list of things that naturalism would have to explain in order for you to...
Right, specified complexity and genetic information. Right, so again, I'm not saying that...
So
this is
100% of the time, we, meaning all of us apparently, infer intelligent design when we look at the specified complexity of genetics.
So I don't agree with you that a fact is only a fact if it confirms one theory.
No, that's evidence.
Right. So I don't agree with you. The fact is only evidence if it infers.
Okay, give me an example of a fact that is evidence of two different mutually exclusive conclusions at the same time.
Sure. Cosmic background radiation can be used as evidence for the Big Bang, and it can be used for evidence of the eternal state of the universe. It's used by both theories to support themselves.
They're both trying to account for the same fact.
Correct.
That's not making it evidence of being an indicative. Because by definition, by everybody's definition, it's the fact that indicates.
Okay, but both of them are using evidence for their theory. Now, I think, for example, that the Big Bang cosmic inflation is a far superior, better use of that fact as evidence for itself. I find the steady state use of that fact as evidence for itself is very ad hoc and doesn't work very well. So the specified complexity of genetic information. Now, it might be the case that something like Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for something like that. That's fine. I'm not here arguing in this instance that it is only evidence for the existence of God.
Well, you did say 100% of the time we see this and we assume an intelligent. Does that give me an example of what we
right. Let me finish my thought. Right. So what I'm saying is because you said that what I'm saying is a God of the gaps, and I'm saying the difference is that inferring God as an abductive, as abduction, as the best possible explanation, I think, for a given piece of data, based on what we do in other analogous cases, is not simply saying, well, I don't know why the paper's here, therefore it must be God. It's saying we have features here that in every analogous situation we infer mind. So in this one, I still think it's abductively right to infer mind. It's not merely saying mystery, therefore God. That's why that's the only reason I bring this up is because you asked for an example to explain why I'm not giving a God of the gaps in that case, why they're conceptual.
I'm still looking for the 100% we infer design.
Can you think of an analogous situation with the exception of specified complexity, because that's the issue under debate, where we have specificity, complexity, and information where we are irrational to infer mind.
In your previous reference to genetics, I think you're talking about, it seems that you're going on about maybe irreducible complexity, perhaps?
No.
Okay. Well, you said that 100% of the time we see this and we assume an intelligence. So I'm looking for that example of...
No. So I'm sorry. I see the misunderstanding is. I'm not saying 100% of the time, and so therefore we only, everybody infers design from specified complexity of genetic information. That's not my claim. So what I'm saying is when we come to the issue of genetic information, we have this sample set of specified, complex, informative information that's in the system. What I'm saying is in all other analogous areas where we find those features, whether or not we agree, we at least think it's reasonable to infer mind. I actually, unless you can provide it, I can't think of a counterexample where we see such information and we don't infer mind. So when we see that feature again, it's reasonably to adduce mind again as the explanation. And that's not a blank of the gaps. That's valid abduction.
Okay, so polls of scientists who believe in God, typically mathematicians or engineers are more likely to be believers in God. But strangely, geologists and biologists are not. There's very tiny sample that gives any credence to intelligent design whatsoever, and it's less than 1%. So why is it so? If it's 100% we see genetics and we infer this, then why do we have almost 100% of geneticists that don't see that?
Right. So my claim isn't that 100% we infer God from genetics. My claim was that in every other analogous situation where we see that information, we think it's rational to infer mind. Right? So the claim isn't that 100% of people, scientists, infer mind from that.
What I'm trying to convey is that obviously we're looking at it not as geneticists, so we're making assumptions that probably aren't very valid because actual geneticists don't see it this way.
Well,
and they don't see it.
I would challenge you too, because so I recommend Elaine Howard Eklund. She's on the bibliography. She's done the most comprehensive modern survey of scientists and their belief in God, and it's far higher than most people actually believe it is based on some of the informal surveys of the National Academy of Sciences. It's somewhere that believe in a personal God of about 50 or 60%. So it's actually far higher than most people give credence for. So I would challenge your perception. Now, let's say I grant your claim that 1% of geneticists believe that in intelligent design theory. I'm actually not an intelligent design theorist. I think,
and it's not a theory either.
So I agree. That actually one of my criticisms is that ID is terrible science but good philosophy. I don't actually think it's very good science. I think it's far better philosophy, which is why I'm saying abductively it's a good argument. I think. I don't think it's good science. But this is where we're going to have a breakdown because you're going to think, well, the only things we should reasonably believe are scientific claims, and I'm going to say, well, no, we're completely within our rational realm. It's completely rational to infer mind. That's a philosophical claim to infer mind from something to see the same features and infer mind again.
I think one of the disconnects is in the concept of belief, because I will consider any possibility. I will consider things to be possible. That doesn't mean I believe them.
Right, which is fine. So one of the other issues, and I should have brought this up in the cross-examination, maybe someone could bring it up in the question and answer, is that I agree with you. I think we have a different idea of what belief is. You seem to think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to think that there's this idea of belief in knowledge, not where knowledge is in kind of the philosophical sense of a warranted belief, but where it's a certainty of knowledge, such that belief is kind of equivalent to mere opinion without evidence.
So what I would say is that we do use different contexts. When I say that I believe something, and I try not to say this anymore because it confuses people think that I'm pretending, that I'm make-believing, right? But if I say that I believe something, it means that I think this is true, but I don't know that it's true. But if I talk to a believer, the believer tells me that belief is an act of will, that it's mind over matter, the power of positive thought, that sort of thing. So they're consciously making themselves believe. And so believe is something that you're supposed to force yourself into. Some fundamentalists have told me that. You know, like you just convince yourself that this is true. Like one of my best friends in high school, I became an ordained Southern Baptist minister, told me, just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it.
Right. Yeah, I think, and there I would just simply say that I think you're working on a rather, so one of my criticisms is it's not necessarily that you're wrong in that, right? Because I have met those same people, right? My pushback to you is simply, I wouldn't use that as the one and only thing that faith or belief is, just because you have a bad example of it.
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm using every example I can find.
Right.
From theologians, and I said from sermons, from hymns, from scripture, not just Christian scripture, but numerous scriptures. They all come up with the same definition, that it is a firm conviction that is not supported or is independent of evidence.
Yeah.
And you said yourself that you're not an empiricist, so you're confirming my point.
Well, no, because I don't think that. So, for example, I'm not an empiricist, so I don't hold the epistemology of logical positivism, where I can only believe something if I have empirical evidence for it. I've given examples where I can believe something based on logical evidence, rational evidence, historical evidence.
See, that's why I don't identify as a logical positivist.
Right.
Because I identify as a rationalist, because I also accept that you can use logic as well.
Right. I've actually just said that I actually. And I can give you lots and lots and lots and lots of other sources that you might not have, where faith isn't actually defined as some type of opinionated belief in the absence or in the teeth of evidence, right? Rather, what it is faith is not a cognitive category, but a volitional category. So the example I use is I could be standing before two bridges. I could have a fantastic state-of-the-art Golden Gate type bridge, and there could be a little rickety rope bridge, whatever it is. I could have empirical evidence that one of them will carry me across the cavern or the ravine, and one of them will not. I could ignore the evidence, I could go with the evidence, I could have good evidence, I could have bad evidence, all that kind of stuff. It's irrelevant to what faith is. It's not that faith is a belief in the virtue of not having evidence. It's that evidence is not determinative of what faith is. Faith is the volitional decision to act. Right, so when I exercise faith is when I actually step out onto one of the bridges. Now I might exercise faith based on good evidence, I might exercise faith on bad evidence. I might have married a woman based on good evidence that she's going to be faithful, and my act of faith was in
Well,
my
now we're
trust
using
to marry her.
equivocation, because
That's not equivocation.
You're mixing
That's what
contexts.
definitions
Yeah, you've got two contexts in the dictionary. You've got one where faith is trust, and then you have the other, which is the religious context, which is a firm belief without evidence. In every case I've ever encountered, when I have always the Christian says, no, faith is not a belief that is not based on evidence. Absolutely ever. They always say what you do. And then I say, okay, what's your evidence? Never have any.
Okay.
I haven't ever met a Christian that can present evidence. They insist that they have faith and that that's just a trust in the evidence, they might want to say, but they don't actually have evidence. So they're proving my point by lacking that in every case.
Well, actually, no. I mean, me saying here and saying that that's not actually what faith is evidence, by the way, ironically, against your claim that that's just what the religious person believes. And I'm saying that's not.
I can show the
and
sources that back up what it
I'm
is.
saying, again, I might have good evidence or bad evidence. The point of faith is the volitional decision to act.
Right.
That's
right.
actually what faith is. Now, I might
but
have
it
good
still
evidence.
comes to, but it's still.
But it's irrelevant. Whether or not
then
I
it
can
becomes
give
just trust.
whether or not I can give good evidence for it or not is irrelevant to what faith actually is as an act of volition. Now, I think I could actually give good evidence. The question comes down to, and this is why I asked you what evidence would qualify that would contradict your belief and prove the existence of God. The question is, what counts between the two of us as good evidence, as qualifying evidence? And I think that I was able to demonstrate that your view is actually unfalsifiable because there's no level of evidence, even empirical, because you only allow empirical evidence. Once you only allow empirical evidence, you default.
You asked what kind of evidence, right?
So you default that any
What other kind
natural
of evidence is
explanation would be more plausible.
What other kind of evidence is there? We're talking about a scientific claim, so it should be scientific evidence.
I
right?
disagree that God is a scientific claim. So this is the point of the disagreement, is you're saying never does a Christian ever give evidence. Well, no, never does a Christian give evidence that is in line with your narrow definition of evidence as only being scientific question about empirical evidence. That'd be like me saying, okay, prove to me that God doesn't exist, but only use literary theory of Shakespearean literature. I've so defined what I will allow as evidence arbitrarily.
It's time.
Okay.
All right, we'll go ahead and take a quick break. We're allotted 10 minutes, but if you guys want to come back a little bit early, say in 5 minutes, we have the closing statements, the negative closing by Tyler, the positive closing by Aron, and then we will open it up to question and answer. So if you guys get back early, we have more time for question and answers. So the choice is yours. Choose as you will. Thank you guys very much. Good discussion.
How long is that?
See the live stream?
I can try using Joel's phone and check it out and see.
Because someone just commented, man, I wish I was there. I want to ask a question. But I can't even type on there to tell them you can.
Yeah.
I don't want to access
Yeah,
the video through here because of their internet, so
yeah.
chew up their data.
Yeah.
understand. Oh, wait. Okay. I think someone told me he could. He said, here's my question.
Okay, cool.
The problem is I don't know how to.
Okay, so he's not.
There should be an X there that you can't get to it because of the.
Yeah. I think it'll go away once.
Yeah. Yeah, once someone comments, it should.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate that. Yeah, that's where somebody should be good. So hopefully he'll ask his question soon.
Yeah, he's
Okay.
back there.
So it's gonna.
Streaming on YouTube, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
How is it possible to conduct scientific research in a world that is not run by a
Hey, I've got
God?
bars back here. How about that?
Yeah.
There's one you want.
Yeah. So how is it possible?
It's possible for what?
How is it possible to conduct scientific research in a world that is not run by a triune God? Alrighty. Well, that's what they want.
Hello. Okay, we will go ahead and get started with the negative closing by Tyler. We're allowing 5 minutes. Time will begin when you start speaking.
All right. As we've seen in this discussion, one of the favorite tactics appears to be the Gaps Fallacy, which is just the overloading of various information without the possibility to respond to. We've been given certain question-begging assumptions about how do they define evidence, faith, reason, in such a way that it's entirely within his own worldview, making his view unfalsifiable, ironically, a feature that should never be allowed within science itself. When asked for empirical evidence of his assertion, he could only say what would be evidence of other claims. So when asked for empirical evidence about his belief that empirical evidence is the only qualifying, he could only give evidence about prayer studies and faith and the like. This is repackaged logical positivism. Logical positivism is a failed epistemology of the mid-20th century, recognized as a failure by nearly every single epistemologist out there today. If you don't know what logical positivism is, I recommend going and looking it up and seeing why it's been so thoroughly abandoned. The epistemology of modern atheism really just is neo-logical positivism. That's the problem. Now, when Ra got to the questions concerning the history of it, he simply got the facts wrong. He got them wrong regarding Augustine, Bruno, Galileo, Copernicus, and Columbus. I didn't pick those ones out at random. Those are ones that he's been talking about for years, and he gets the facts simply wrong. Now, if he got simple historic facts wrong, that literally any first-year student with a library card and an Amazon Prime account can find, Why should we think that he has done any more objective research or understanding in the vastly more complex issues of science, epistemology, theology, biblical studies, let alone the meta questions about the standards, terms, definitions, concepts, practices, and so forth within those disciplines? We shouldn't allow someone to win a debate via definitional fiat. You can't allow someone to simply say, I'm going to win by defining concepts how I want to define concepts. That's not a rational or possible way to win a debate. So going back to the question of history and Christianity, Gary Fendrick, published at Johns Hopkins University, writes this in closing. While some historians had always regarded the Draper-White thesis as oversimplifying and distorting a complex relationship, in the late 20th century it underwent a more systematic reevaluation. The result is the growing recognition among historians of science that the relationship of religion and science has been much more positive than is sometimes thought. Although popular images of controversy continue to exemplify the supposed hostility of Christianity to new scientific theories, studies have shown that Christianity has often nurtured and encouraged scientific endeavor, while at other times the two have coexisted without either tension or attempts of harmonization. Thank you.
And we will now hear from Rob. Time will begin when you start speaking.
You know, after listening to his presentation, I don't know what facts I got wrong. He seems to be thinking that I'm thinking or believing things that I don't think or believe. Christianity is just one of the many religions invented by imaginative men pretending to speak for the various gods or ghosts of their ancestors, maybe an extraterrestrial telepath, maybe a spirit animal. The dogma is different for all of them, of course, but with as many variations as there are believers, which is just what you would expect of man-made mythology. Strip away all the differences, and what they have in common is that all religions are faith-based belief systems positing the notion that a supernatural essence of self somehow survives the death of the physical body to continue on in some other form. There is nothing remotely scientific about any of that. It's not just that there's absolutely no indication of a soul, where there certainly would be if such things were real. Even if souls are supernatural, there would still be a way to test for it. If the supernatural were real, we would have people like Spock, Obi-Wan, Gandalf, or Hermione who could demonstrate that, so that science could verify it, even if we couldn't explain it. Faith healers, fortune tellers, and spirit psychics wouldn't all be criminal frauds like we know that absolutely all of them are. If the supernatural were real, there would be at least some of them who could actually do something, but none of them can, none of them ever could. We know that the people who wrote the Bible thought that the movement of air was itself a spirit, that the reason people think they have a soul inside them today is because, well, that's what ancient primitives thought was the breath of life before they learned about microscopic chemical particles. The problem isn't that the belief is wrong, it's why the belief is wrong, because it's based on faith, which is auto-deceptive and misleading to delusion. We either base our beliefs on evidence in an attempt to reason, or we base them on faith, wherein believing becomes a conscious act of will. One of my Christian friends is a minister who described faith as lying to yourself until you believe it, although the way he phrased it was, fake it till you make it. So faith healers offer no way to, or faith offers no way to discover the real truth about anything, but it's a great way to stay wrong forever and never know it. Science works because it is the antithesis of faith. Science changes all the time because it's always improving, separating fact from fiction, like a game of 20 questions, where even if you don't yet know for sure what's right, you at least know what's wrong, and every question gets you closer to the truth. Christianity can't do that. If it could, there wouldn't be 30,000 different denominations, and attendance around the world wouldn't be declining like it is. There wouldn't be hundreds of millions of people believing in other religions, and the atheist movement wouldn't be so full of so many people like me who were once Christian. The greatest conflict between your religion and science is that Christianity is a belief system, meaning that you have required beliefs and prohibited beliefs. You get the impossible promise of a posthumous reward if you believe what you're told and give homage to the clergy, but you'll be punished in this life and face the empty threat of a fate worse than death if you believe differently, whether apostasy or heresy doesn't matter. Science works exactly opposite of that. It has to in order to improve understanding. The only way to get rich and famous in science is to discover something no one else knows, or to challenge the status quo to show that the experts got it wrong. The only way to do that is to show that you got it right and do it so well that the experts admit it. If you can do that, then rather than being burned at the stake or locked in the stocks, you'll receive $1 million reward and worldwide recognition and respect. Instead of a belief system, science promotes free thought. Science doesn't care what you believe. All that matters is why you believe it. Is your evidence sound enough to convince me that you might be right or that I might be wrong? And if I am wrong, I will thank you for setting me straight, because at least I won't be wrong anymore. That's how science works, and that's why faith doesn't work and isn't honest about it either. If scientists proclaimed empty assertions of absolute certainty the way believers do, they'd lose all credibility immediately and be treated as frauds, because that's what religion is. Reason and religion could not be any more different, since they have polar opposite goals and values, and that's why Christianity has always been in conflict with science.
Okay, we'll now open the floor for questions. The first question will be directed to Aron Ra. This is from Caleb Johnson. How do you justify holding so many views on Scripture that are based on your own personal presuppositions instead of evidence or scholarly opinion?
I don't have them on presuppositions. That was his presupposition that I do, but I don't.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, just stand, say your question, and if, actually, hold on. Yeah. You can just come forward and ask your question.
Hi. Can you explain what you mean by logical positivism? You use that word a lot, and articulate how exactly that would be our epistemology.
Absolutely. Logical positivism was a view of rationality put forward by people like Aron and others in the early to mid 20th century that basically said that if you were to believe something, that in order to believe something that's actually true, you have to not only have empirical evidence for it, but you have to have this hard principle of falsification for it as well. The problem with logical positivism, and I'll get to why it's the same epistemology that's being espoused today. The problem with logical positivism, and this is why it's been rejected by epistemologists the world over, is that the claim itself doesn't have empirical support for it. So if you think of the claim, we should only believe the things that are empirically verifiable. Right? We should only believe the things we should only put things in the bucket of belief that we can have direct empirical evidence for. That claim itself, that we should only put things in the bucket that have empirical evidence for, is not something that directly has empirical evidence for it. It's a philosophical, it's a meta-empirical claim about the nature of epistemology, about the types of things we should believe. Right? So it itself is what's called reflexively destructive. It defeats itself. If it's true that I should only believe the things that have empirical evidence, then I shouldn't believe that, because that doesn't have empirical evidence. So if it's true, I ought to reject it. And so the epistemology of naturalism these days that we're getting from Ra and others is this idea of, and you hear it over and over again, well, give me evidence, give me evidence, give me evidence, and what they mean is empirical evidence. But the standard by which, and this is why I pushed on what type of evidence would be qualified for his belief to be wrong, the standard of evidence itself that's being used doesn't have empirical evidence. It is, to use faith in the term that he means it, not the way that I mean it, it's a faith-based commitment. It's a belief without empirical evidence in the idea that we should only believe things that have empirical evidence.
That's probably why I said that I'm not a logical positivist. But he's now taking his turn to tell me what I believe. When I said that you should resist belief and only be compelled when the evidence compels you. Okay, there's justification there, but you should withhold on that as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. This question is from Jimmy Stevens on our YouTube channel. I'm assuming it's directed to Aron Ra. How is it possible to conduct scientific research in a world that is not run by a triune God?
You want to do one with a Hindu God? Does that work better? Is there a way we can experiment for that? How about a straight monotheistic God that isn't triune? How about no God? Let's do that. Maybe we shouldn't assume things that aren't evidently true. That would be good.
Any other questions? I saw your hand first, so just step to the.
Okay, so this question is for Aron. First of all, thank you both gentlemen for coming and presenting your cases. It was an interesting discussion, and I appreciate you both giving your thoughts. I do have a question for Aron, in that I haven't really heard one specific reason for believing that Christianity is incompatible with science. What I have heard is that you've given examples of Christians who may have opposed scientific advancement, although whether they did or not in actuality might be up for debate. But I haven't heard exactly one fact about Christianity itself which makes it incompatible with science. You did assert, though I don't think you proved, that faith and science are polar opposites. And so I was wondering if maybe you could be a little more specific about why you believe Christianity and science might be polar opposites, and why Christianity itself is incompatible with science or scientific.
That was my goal. That was why I never went for the single Christian exception that he blamed me for. I didn't do that. It had to be an authority. It had to be somebody leading groups of people. It had to be somebody representing Christianity. And as I specified, in the 1600s, Catholicism could be said to be representative of Christianity, or certainly in the first millennium, it's certainly representative of Christianity. So we're fair game there. But the only single Christian that I mentioned as having any clout at all was Jesus himself. He believed in demons. Now he wants the empirical evidence that he says I can't provide, that Jesus believed in demons, or that demons aren't real, or casting demons out of people isn't the way to heal. But I don't think I'm really under that much of a burden of proof to provide the empirical evidence of that. Jesus believed in demons. There are no demons. Why? Because that was just asserted without evidence, maybe dismissed without evidence. And despite all of our tests, we've never been able to show a single instance of there being demons. So belief in demons, and that's the way you heal people, and Jesus didn't ever tell anybody about microorganisms or pathogens or any of that. In fact, he told them not to wash their hands, right? So Jesus had no idea what he was talking about. Yeah, I got empirical evidence for that. That's what the story says he believes in demons. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, let's just add, this is I think a prime example of where Ra simply just gets the history wrong. Again, not only did the Roman Catholic Church not exist in the first century, and the Protestants existed in the 16th century.
I said the first millennium.
Okay, but in dealing with the time,
you keep telling me I get facts wrong, but you haven't told me a fact I've gotten wrong.
Your claims about Bruno being executed.
What did I say
he was executed
that was wrong?
He was executed for his Copernicanism.
I said he was executed. I said they burned him at the stake. I didn't say why.
Okay.
You have not named a fact that I got. You assumed that I believed a bunch of things that I didn't believe, and you thought I didn't know stuff I knew. And you attacked me for not knowing the thing that I knew that you didn't know I knew. So that's the best you did.
Columbus falsified the flat Earth?
No.
You didn't make that
I said the science already established that 1,800 years earlier. I said Columbus disproved it yet again.
That's not what the issue was.
Which obviously,
but anyways,
I already know about Ferdinand and all that. You did not name a fact I got wrong.
Okay. We'll let people listening tell that.
Yeah, I hope they are, and it's recorded.
Yeah. So, dealing with the question of what Jesus was doing, there's the assumption that Jesus thought that exorcising a demon was what healing was, right? So if someone is sick, it's because of the demon, rather than just saying, well, no, he believed that there was demon. I agree that he believed there was demons. He believed there was demon possession, so he was exorcising the demon. There's an assumption being made that Jesus thought that demon possession was the health issue related to sickness, for example. And I think that's not word to the claim. There's claiming that Jesus said you don't need to wash your hands, which would be very weird for a rabbi that thought that every single time you ate there was a purification ritual that had to go through the washing of hands. This is why I pushed on the claim that defilement doesn't equal unhealthy. Defilement was a religious term. It was a religious concept about impurity. It had nothing to do with health related issues. There's a conflation that's happening in those ones.
Your question? Yeah, next question.
Tyler, Vela and Aron Ra, thanks for coming to Waco.
Thanks for that.
I got a question for both of you. Mr. Vela, is there anything that you would say is in the Bible that you believe conflicts with modern concepts in science, like a 4 billion year old Earth, or And if that's the case, should we believe the Bible or should we believe science?
Right.
And then to Aron, if you don't mind, giving us a couple more examples where the Bible conflicts with science, because I'd like to hear some more as well, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'll actually supply more for you. So if you remember my question about concordism, and I asked, does a Christian have to be a concordist? There's a view that whatever views that the Bible reflects the culture of the day, that therefore is teaching it as a Christian, we have to affirm it. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people don't even know this example. I'll provide you one. You can, if you don't know it, I'm sure you do, but you can use it later. The Bible, during the biblical times, they very clearly thought that you believed, and your center of the will and the emotion was your guts, and that you had your volitional aspect in your kidneys. Very, very clear throughout. Every single time you read the Old Testament, it says, he was cut to the heart. No, he was cut to his kidneys. Believe, love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and strength. Nope, bowels and kidneys. So there's a question. We know from modern anatomy, you don't think with your kidneys and your intestines, right? I don't think that I do. So am I being in conflict with what the Scripture teaches because I believe in modern anatomy, right? The answer is no, because I'm not a concordist. I don't think that whatever the Scripture, in communicating to an ancient audience as they would understand it, I don't think that therefore I'm obligated to believe that kind of background assumption. It's not something that's being affirmed. It's not saying you have to believe that you think with your kidneys. It's just talking to people who thought they believed with their kidneys. And the point of the communication is not to give them an anatomical lesson. The point is to tell them, you need to love God. Whatever you think you love God with, who cares? You need to love God. That's the point of the passage. So, for example, in the age of the earth, I get a lot of pushback from all sides of my Christian brothers and sisters, because I'm not an old earth creationist or a young earth creationist, because I don't think that's what Genesis 1 is about. I don't think it tells us. I don't think it's the point. I think it's a second millennia BC temple text dealing with the creation of sacred space, apart from the chaos used to polemicize and satirize the gods of the surrounding nations. So when my brothers and sisters, if my fellow Christians come and they say, oh well, it's about material origins, I'm just saying, well, I just don't think that's what the text is. So questions about the age of the earth and things like that, I just don't really find that relevant. But again, I'm also not a concordist, so I don't think that we need to take those background assumptions of the culture when God says, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Job probably thought the earth was sitting on a pillar with a glass dome firmament over it. I don't really care. God is saying, are you so prideful that you thought you were there when all of this began? However you believe it happened, are you that prideful? Is the point of the passage. It's not actually giving us a cosmogonic layout.
And the other examples, I mean, toward the end of the 3rd chapter of my book, I go through a list of things that the Bible says about the earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos. They're all crazy. I mean, it's like the stars have personalities and can come down to the earth and do battle with a human being. That's obviously the book was written by people who didn't realize that this isn't a flat plane and that this is only one sphere among many. But my biggest issue with the scientific claims of the Bible is that I am into taxonomy, if anybody, the classification of life forms, and the Bible gets all of that wrong. I mean, it says that whales are fish, it says that bats are birds, and then elsewhere it says that bats are locusts. And then everything is divided into this indeterminable sort of kind thing, like kinds of kinds, like birds, for example. There's all kinds of birds. Well, aren't they all the bird kind? But then it also says there's all sorts of birds. What the hell is a sort? How many kinds of sorts of birds are there? Right? So and then the way that they classify other organisms, depending on the translation of the Bible that you get, I forget where it is, where they talk about the things that you can eat. It goes through this list of things that you can eat, where the list of animals is different in every translation. I think where one of them, I think it's Wibbly, it lists everything that you can't eat. Everything you can't eat is a lizard. But in another one, some of the lizards have been changed out for weasels or cockatrice or, sometimes birds or whatever, or mammals, weasels. I don't get it.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah. The taxonomy issue is, it's just not an issue. Taxonomy is an arbitrary distinction in ways that we subdivide things. There's nothing inherently taxonomical about things. So I could go to all birds and I could say, okay, well, I can give a taxonomical difference between, the carnivorous ones compared to the herbivore ones. I can give taxonomy between finches and sparrows. I could arbitrarily subdivide based on whatever feature I want to decide. If you actually go to the Hebrew text of the Bible, which again, what English translations do with these texts is largely irrelevant to whether or not the text is accurate or not. What it actually says is basically the winged things. It's not saying, hey, 21st century Americans, you know what bats are, and you have your taxonomy of birds. Well, I'm going to say bats are birds. It just includes bats in its category of winged things. So it's not a taxonomical problem. It's just they just subdivide things differently.
The reason it's a taxonomical problem is because the Bible classifies things by what they do rather than what they are. So they're flying things, they're swarming things. That's why bats are in two different categories. That's why whales are fish, they're swimming things. That's why lobsters are fish, because they're fish that don't have fins. Then these are forbidden for whatever reason. And you cannot. I mean, you can arbitrarily classify things incorrectly, but actual taxonomy is not arbitrary. It's objectively verifiable.
Well, I just don't see how it's played. I mean, it's arbitrary in the sense of we're saying this feature, we want this feature to be the defining thing. Right? I mean, we can determine what feature it is. I could taxonomically say, okay, I'm going to subdivide the mammals, and I'm going to have the I don't know the actual names. I'm going to have the rabbits on one thing, and the bovines on the other. Or I could say, okay, well, I'm going to give a taxonomical based on function. I'm going to do it based on what they do, and I'm going to say all the things that chew the cud, which actually eat their food, swallow it.
It includes rabbits, by the way, which is another thing.
Rabbits are book. But those are all things that chew the cud. So
rabbits don't chew cud.
But if I'm saying that's how I'm gonna divide them, then that's how I'm just gonna include the things that functionally do that. And it's not. There's no contradiction to say I'm gonna taxonomically divide things differently than how we define them and divide them based on genetic and family and things like that, because those are the things that we've decided how we want to taxonomically define things.
Yeah, you can put all the green ones over here and all the brown ones over there, but that's the arbitrary way of doing it. Taxonomy is not that way. It's objective. We can verify what the definitive features are.
Okay.
Next question. Yes.
I was next.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry.
First I want to determine what your position is, and I'm really overall trying to drill down to why you believe you have evidence to believe in Christianity. But I want to know what your belief is first. Or do you have like a C.S. Lewis belief that Jesus is God's taking the mythology of the Hebrews and making it real, just using the existing mythology? Is that where you're at? Because I don't see the distinction of why you're saying you're Christian, because you're saying you don't believe this about the Bible or that it's literal. So what?
Right.
Briefly.
Good question. So I'm not a C.S. Lewis Christian. I appreciate some of his insights. I am a historic Protestant, so I'm going to affirm what's called the redemptive historical approach. So the redemptive historical approach is effectively that when God set up the cosmos and created everything, everything follows and points towards Christ. So it's not that God is saying, okay, well, marriage is really big to these people, so I'm going to describe my relationship between Christ and the church as marriage because they really like marriage. It's that there's something in the institution of marriage that reflects back on the love that Christ has for his people. So I would actually reverse the arrow from what C.S. Lewis is doing. But sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but to answer the kind of further question of, I don't think a certain view of creation or Genesis 1 is the sine qua non of Christianity. I don't think that in order to be a Christian, that is effectively just in order to place your trust in Christ as a Savior. There's a very minimal amount that's needed for that. I don't think that your view of Genesis 1 and creation is one of those requirements.
Okay, so do you believe that that is literature, mythology, and that the Old Testament has a mixture of history and literature? Is that what?
Very good question. So when we get into biblical literature, genre is very important, and we have to read it in the context and the history that it's in. So we have, in the 21st century, we have a genre of literature known as historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It is fiction that is written in such a way that it appears to be actual history, but it's not. That's not a genre that existed back then. I actually get pushback again on my fellow Christians because they'll say, oh, well, the Gospels are just straightforward history. They're not. They're actually a very specific genre of biography known as bios, which was basically it's almost a hagiographic biography written to emperors and kings, very, very important persons. They usually follow a very thematic development rather than a straight what's called diachronic or through time development. So there's very specific features of the genre. It gets even more different when you now leave kind of first century Greco-Roman Hellenistic culture, which is closer to it's not the same as us, but it's closer. And then you go into kind of ancient Near Eastern
Greco
Hebrew
and
culture.
Roman history doesn't have like the literal Jesus God person. Like theirs are just like they're telling their stories, and it was more thematic, and maybe there was some kernel of truth in them, but they're trying to tell a theme.
No, so I wouldn't say that just because something is literal or thematic that therefore it's not historical or true, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can give examples of the poem "The Midnight Ride" of Paul Revere, right? It is thematic. It breaks actually the chronology of the event in certain ways to tell the story in a more poetic way, to draw out some of the tensions that were happening at the time. But we don't look at the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and be like, well, because it's literary and thematic, therefore it's not historical.
Is Jesus literary and thematic in your belief system, or is he an actual historical person?
Yes, I think the Gospels are that genre of writing known as bios,
Okay.
which develops about a historical person.
So you don't literally think he walked on water?
No, I do. Again, just because something is thematic, or you could have, I could use symbolism. I could say something like, I would be lying, so don't hold it against me. I could say, we went to Waco and the whole town came out. I'd obviously be wrong. That might be close, actually. I'm from LA, so the most crowded places down here feel a little disparate. But I could say something like that, and I could say I went to the concert and the whole town came out. Right? I'm saying something literal and actual. I'm saying it was extremely crowded. The place was packed. It felt like everyone was there. But it doesn't actually mean that literally every single person came out. But I'm not saying something that there actually was a concert and there were tons of people there and I went there. I'm not saying something that's non-historical.
It's giving the gist of what happened, a broad brush of it?
I don't know if I'd say the gist.
Like they don't have it every detail down, but you get the idea from the story?
A lot of times. So Aron brought up the example of the man with the faith healing, right? The partial healing of that. He says, well, that's a failed faith healing. I'm using this example because I actually wrote a paper on it. So in that case, what's happening is in the narrative of Mark where it's found, what's happening is we're seeing the disciples exercising a lack of faith. They keep messing up. They keep not believing.
And that's the message of the
right. So what happens is they keep not believing, but they're kind of progressively getting there, and then they'll stumble, they'll fall back, and they get there and some. So what Jesus is doing is he's doing kind of a parabolic miracle where something happens, but it doesn't quite happen, and then there's a fallback, and then he does it again, it doesn't quite happen. So Mark is using this event as a parable for what's happening around it. But that doesn't mean that Mark is saying, in this chronology, it literally happened at that time period, in that chronological history. He's pulling out something as an illusion, putting it in the narrative, and saying this is kind of a real life parable of what spiritually is happening among the lives of the apostle. But we would be mistaken to say, well, because that happened, and this one actually doesn't happen in other gospels, but there are events, because that happens in a different location in the gospels, therefore they contradict each other. Because the genre itself wasn't, they didn't do history like we did. They didn't care.
With the lesson to their reader than they were with the detailed
kind of the order of
accuracy.
Events and things like that. Yeah, it was drawing on spiritual
And
principles.
you're not saying, even though they might have not had consistent details, you're not saying that the disciples didn't exist at all?
Correct.
They just don't have every detail down accurately?
Again, I wouldn't say it would be, and this might sound weird, it would be by our standards of modern reportage. We might look at it and say it's inaccurate.
Okay.
But for them, that wasn't the purpose. That's not why they wrote. That's not how they wrote. That's not the method. Now we might look at that and say, okay, well, based on how we would like things to be done, that's they shouldn't write that way. But that's somewhat chronocentric, right? We should try to understand their writing, how they meant it. So in the same way that we mean modern reportage, 2,000 years ago, or 2,000 years from now, they might look at things very different. I don't know how, and look at us and be like, oh, well, we don't like how they did it.
I think I understand your position better, and I'm perhaps not arguing with that, but I just didn't want to argue with
No, I
what you're
appreciate
not
it.
saying.
Yeah.
Okay, his question, and this goes to the overarching question. The things that you would accept as evidence of what was it? It wasn't atheism. What was the question? Okay, or maybe it was Arn's question to you, that of what you consider evidence for your position.
He said that I was being unfair in a discussion about science and Christianity, that I was demanding scientific evidence, which is expected to be empirical. Because of the constraints of the debate, I'm being unfair by demanding scientific evidence.
This isn't the question I'm asking, I don't think.
Well, he was saying that I was limiting it. There was other types of evidence, and so I asked him, what other types of evidence?
And what were those? The laws of logic?
Yeah, so I would argue that things like the laws of logic can be evidence, objective morality, specified complexity. I think that can be arguments of history. I think that we could have a personal evidence for things. So for example, I can't give, right now, how many of you, some of you know me by now and know the statement, but some of you don't. How many of you know that I have a migraine right now?
I have a migraine, okay.
Right? None of you do, right? Because that's something that pain reception is a personal experience, internal only to myself.
But I do have that effect on people.
You don't. I actually have a condition where I have a migraine every single day. So some people know that. Some people don't, but they only know it by testimony, right? So, but I know what the experience of the migraine pain is in a way that's different than everybody else knows.
Testimony.
I can't give a certain type of evidence to everybody sitting here right now. Now, based on what I've said, how many of you believe that I have a migraine right now? Right?
I believe you because there's no real reason.
There's no reason not to, because you believe my testimony now is testimony, a type of empirical evidence. We can go, is it scientific? Is it not? I mean, we can go into all these types of debates, but none of you say, okay, well, until I have scientific evidence, I'm going to restrain belief based on your testimony. Now, some of you might think, oh, he's a Christian, he's probably lying, he's doing it. I have no idea what people think about me. You guys might think I'm terrible.
There's also the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Which I disagree with.
If you're not making an extraordinary claim, then we don't have much reason to
and I would disagree. I would say extraordinary claims require sufficient evidence.
Sufficient is fine too.
But the issue is that I can have personal. My point was simply I can have personal experience that might be evidence that warrants to me. But I might not be able to use it as justification to convince you, obviously, right? So I can have certain evidence that warrants my own belief, but that I'm not able to use, and I don't think I should use. I don't use. I don't typically use personal experience as an argument for something else. But if you're asking why I have warrant for belief, I can have personal experience as a warrant for belief. So that's a type of evidence.
Okay, awesome. So you're saying laws of logic, specified complexity, objective morality, personal testimony, there's a relationship between these things and a sufficient reason to believe in God?
Those are factors that give me sufficient warrant for reasonable belief.
Okay, and here's my question.
On this question.
Okay. Are you aware of the null hypothesis?
I think so, but if you would like to describe what you mean.
Okay. The null hypothesis is there's no relationship between two phenomena.
Right.
And in order to overcome the null hypothesis, you have to have evidence. Like, for example, autism, people thought because there was a correlation between the onset of autism at 18 months and also vaccines, that autism was caused by vaccines. But that relationship actually didn't really exist. It was just, it was a coincidence.
Right.
So, like, in order for you to get, to say that you have sufficient reason to believe, you have to overcome the null hypothesis. I mean, why wouldn't it be better to say, I don't know if there is a reason to believe or not,
right,
until I have evidence I can show everybody.
Right. So, basically what you're going for is kind of the difference between correlation and causation. If we think back to like a Humean, David Hume skepticism, where he basically said, look, I can't even know, I can't I can't use induction. I can't know that just because I hit a billiard ball and it hits the other billiard ball, that correlation, that the cue ball actually caused the other billiard ball to move. Right? There's a disjunct in induction between the two things. So you can have a type of a hard skeptical.
It's also statistical probability too. Like there could be a teapot orbiting the Earth, but the more complex the claim, the more complex the variables, and the more improbable. So you're positing a mind behind logic, a ubermind that nobody can see or test. So in order for us to prove it,
go ahead and
let me. Thank you for your question. Let me finish the answer. The problem of induction is solved effectively by saying, well, the first one is just induction is obviously possible. We need induction. You actually need induction in order to undermine deduction. The other one is, depending on the question that you have, the type of evidence, again, might be different. So a teapot orbiting the Earth. This kind of goes under Alvin Flanagan's no-seeums, right? No-seeums, if you live in like the Great Lakes area, are little tiny gnats that you literally cannot see. They're so small they get through screens. And he's saying, look, if there's a no-seeum in this room, I wouldn't be expected to have evidence of a no-seeum. Right, the type of evidence that I would have to use to find a no-seeum is different than what I would expect to find if there was an elephant in the room, and it's different than what I expect to find if there's a mind in the room. Right, so the asking what type of evidence we would use for these types of questions is different. So I would say, as a Christian, and because I deny empiricism and logical positivism, that things like laws of logic, objective morality, specified complexity, something from nothing, right? All these types of things, personal experience, the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit, all these types of things are warranting evidence for me to believe, and some of them I might be able to use to present to others.
Before we continue, I do have one question. This is from Jimmy Stevens, for both Tyler and Ra. Christians appear to have a reason to care about science. God commands us to be truthful and to rule over creation. What reasons can a naturalist or a rationalist give to care about being scientific?
What about if your primary motivation is that you care about truth? Because all you want to know is you want to improve your understanding, right? So if you're going to improve your understanding, then the information you have has to be accurate. You want to make sure that it's accurate. So lies are treated by us like similar to violence. It's something that you would do, that is only excusable in moments of self-defense, for example, and maybe not even excusable then. So that's why we perform science, because we love truth. And that's also why, coincidentally, we're not religious. Because I can't make myself believe in things that are not evidently true and continue to believe that anyway.
Yeah, so I would rephrase in order to answer Jimmy's question away from intention, because I think Ra is actually. So I keep using your last name. I mean it as respectful. I'm sorry.
Everybody calls me Arn.
Okay.
Everybody calls me Tyler. We're good.
Okay. I think going away from intention, because as a Christian, I believe that all people are made in the image of God. I think that we actually I agree with you that because of that, while you disagree with the motivation, I think atheists are interested in science because they're interested in truth. I'm going to explain that by appealing to the Imago Dei. You would explain to it by appeal to other features. But at the end of the day, the reason why atheists are interested in science is because ultimately you're interested in truth. I'm fine with that. My question my answer that I would slightly bend the question a little bit is, I think that on naturalism, the intelligibility of the cosmos is up for debate. So on Christian theism, and I think this is what Jimmy was getting at, on Christianity, we would expect an orderly, intelligible, law-abiding cosmos. At least on Christian theism, right? You have an omni-rational personal being that wants to have communion and fellowship with his creation, and as such, an entirely random world would be an unintelligible world. You couldn't do induction. You couldn't draw up principles. You couldn't know that God loved you because loving might one day be a punch in the nose, and the next day might be a hug. It would just be an entirely random universe, right? So on Christian theism, at least, you would expect the rational, coherent structure of the cosmos that we see. On naturalism, where there is no such kind of overarching macro purpose behind cosmos, where everything is at core is random. There's no reason for us to think that the laws of nature there's no reason to think that the laws of nature should have been orderly, right? Obviously, we look around the world and the laws of nature are orderly. So the question isn't whether they are or not. But on naturalism, there's no reason to think why they should have been orderly, why the world should have been intelligible. And so when we look around the cosmos and we say, okay, well, the universe is intelligible, it is rational. There's a correlation between the mind in here and the intelligibility out there. I think is better explained on Christian theism than on naturalism.
Okay, his question and then your question.
Thank you guys for doing this again.
Thank you.
Questions for Tyler. Christianity, the pillar ultimately for Christianity and faith and belief is that Jesus died for your sins and was resurrected, and that he also performed miracles in the name of God. Can you explain to me how resurrection in that instance and other miracles such as him raising Lazarus from the dead aren't in conflict with science?
Sure, yeah. So the issue here is, thank you for the question. The issue here is how we now define science and how we define what purpose is in the Bible. So if I were to come to you and I were to say, God raised Jesus from the dead, and I would say, okay, well, he did it by his own divine providence, right? Didn't do it by natural means. That's not in conflict with science, because science is the objective study of the natural world. It's the normative processes of natural law, of physical function, of forces, right? It's what normatively happens when things are not monkeyed with effectively, right? So if the idea was that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes, right? And I were to say you got to believe that Jesus rose from the dead 3 days later by natural processes, or you have to believe that the axe head floated on the Jordan River by natural processes. That would be an absolute contradiction of science, right? Because everything that tells us about science is what happens and does not happen naturally by natural causes and natural forces, right? So again, I'm very self-aware. My answer is not explaining why something is true, right? So here I'm not defending that the resurrection, I would defend that the resurrection is true, but here in my answer, I'm not trying to say, therefore the resurrection is true. I'm simply trying to say that in principle, it is the type of thing that is not contrary to science, simply because it's not trying to give, it's not using a scientific explanation and saying, this is what happened naturalistically. You know, you still might argue that it's false or wrong or whatever it is, but it wouldn't be so because of the science. One more caveat we could say, and I think this is where Aron would jump in and want to say as well, you still, even if it doesn't contradict science, although I think he would say it does, he would still say, okay, well, you're not reasonable to believe it anyways. So even if it doesn't contradict, I think he would still say, you're not reasonable to believe it, because the only things you'd be reasonable to believe are the things that you can scientifically demonstrate to be true, right? And so, and that's, I think, where most of our disagreement has come, is I'm gonna say, well, no, I think.
Didn't you say that extraordinary claims require sufficient evidence?
I think
I agree with that.
Yeah. So
and that's not sufficient evidence.
And that's where we're going to disagree of what requires sufficient evidence, what counts as sufficient evidence.
Okay, yes.
Hey, hello.
Hi.
My question is, the topic of the debate is whether or not Christianity has historically conflicted with science, right? And under Christianity, evidence that isn't based on empiricism is considered valid, because there's other things besides empirical evidence that we can make claims about. But within science, evidence is confined to empirical evidence. So they're like incompatible.
I think I know your question. So you're basically asking, isn't it almost, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it almost definitionally true that anything that's in Christianity is in conflict with science, because I'm saying that there are other things that aren't empirical, and science only allows for the empirical, right? Is that kind of what you're asking? Okay. My simple answer would be, again, well, twofold. First is that, actually, and I haven't pushed on this, not everything in science is empirical. If you go to very, very theoretical types of physics or other things, there are lots of things that are actually not empirical. You would have to roll in things like logic and mathematics to what's empirical, which I think you're okay with, right?
That's why I said I'm not going to go near cosmology.
So you have a whole bunch of things in science that actually aren't empirical. So I would say that first. My other answer would be, well, even if that was the case, that doesn't mean they conflict with each other, right? That would be like saying, well, you know, in grammar, we don't use empirical evidence either. Therefore, grammar is in conflict with science. It doesn't follow that just because something is different, therefore it's in conflict.
Okay.
You look confused.
Well,
if that didn't answer your question, you can rephrase.
Like you brought up earlier about how, you know, we don't say that Christianity and political science is in conflict, but really they're two completely different modes of thinking. And so even though they're not particularly like related in the sense that, you know, Christianity excludes political science, it's just that I think that they conflict in the ways that they cause people to go about doing things. And so even if they're not,
Well, I think interesting. So you might want to say, okay, well, Christianity is. Were you saying it's in conflict with political science?
No, I'm saying that you can, like what you were just talking about with grammar, you can make the same claim about like science is historically incompatible with grammar or something, because really it's they're dealing with two completely different things.
Right, and I would agree with you. My point would actually be that, well, if you're going to say something is in conflict with something else because they use different methods, then you would actually, you're right. You would be in the position of saying, well, then grammar is historically in conflict with science. Because if that's the principle of relation, that different means conflict, then you are going to be entailing that whatever is different with any other discipline is in conflict with
Then how would you describe conflict?
I would say conflict is something that is actually in contradistinction to something else. Not just that it's different, right?
So science says that anything that we can only believe what is empirically tested, and Christianity says that we can believe things that are not empirically tested, and those two things.
Yeah, so I would say, I would push back. I would say your first definition I don't think that's what science is. I don't think science says we can only believe things that are empirically tested. That's a certain view, that's a certain philosophical epistemology about science known as empiricism. I 100% agree that Christianity and empiricism contradict each other. Absolutely agree with that.
So what
science is the methodology, and I know you're probably jumping too. Science is a very specific methodology, right? And it makes assumptions. So we have what's called methodological naturalism that functions under science. One of the reasons why science is so fantastic and so useful is because specifically it constrains itself. It puts limits on itself. It says, I'm only going to talk about the natural normative function of the cosmos. That's why it's so wildly successful, because it doesn't go putting its nose into things that it doesn't deserve to put its nose in. Right? That's why it's so good. Right? So I'm just going to say, well, one of those things that it doesn't put its nose in is political science, economic theory, art theory, literary science, religion. Those are what are called non-overlapping magisteria. Now, religion also makes the mistake. Aron rightly pointed out cases where someone's saying, oh, well, lightning exists because Thor is angry, or whatever God is angry and he's throwing lightning bolts down. That's religion now stepping into the scientific world, which it shouldn't do. And so there are cases where they kind of go back and forth in ways that they shouldn't go back and forth. So that's why I said there are clearly cases where certain people, certain branches of a religion has contradicted science. I'm not saying that has never happened, but I'm saying religion and Christianity properly understood, I agree they shouldn't do that, but the conflict isn't innate. I don't know if that helps.
Did you want to give a quick? Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to make sure you have a question, sir. Your turn.
I wonder what side you're on. I like your shirt.
Well, thank you. Oh, wow, do I really sound like that? So there was room for debate with the historical influences of Christianity versus science, and I mean, there's definitely room for debate, but I'm actually more concerned about what our present state. Today we have religious influence. We can agree that religion institutes influence scientific progress and the medical health of our population.
I'm going to give a qualified yes.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Do you believe, I've always held the belief that for the Christian community, you have submitted to your leaders, your voices too much, and the moderate Christian has not come out and said, no, I don't believe God is punishing Haiti. No, I don't believe the lesbian and homosexual was responsible for 9/11. No, I don't believe that condoms are bad, but AIDS is bad and condoms are worse. No, I don't believe that. And this is a question for both of you. What is it? Because we're stuck with religion. You guys are stuck with us. We're stuck with you.
Yep, we all get along.
How is it that we can address this as moderate Christians who have a grasp of what, that there is a connection, if there's a God, there's a connection between the natural and the humanity, because, what's happening now is not working. You have our status in education in the world is declining. You have people with vaccinations, we have all the sort of things that it's not just religion, but a strong voice are your religious leaders, and your moderate voices are not being heard. So what can we do, and it's a question for both of you guys, what can we do to at least bring us to consensus? Because we have had humanitarian needs, and we have risen to join forces to combat whatever destructive obstacles we can. And we can do this with this, but what can we do to bring the average person down, up to everything, to one level?
Right. Fantastic question. I've talked a lot. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I was very disturbed when I watched Pat Robertson tell his 30,000 Sunlight followers around 1993 to go out and kill homosexuals where you find them, because that will prevent earthquakes. And I tried to get moderate Christians to watch that, but I can't get them to watch the Trinity Broadcast Network. I can't get them to read Chick tracts. They will donate money to organizations that then funnel into these radical extremists, but they don't understand that these moderates are just the tools of the radical extremists. They will not realize that how they're being misrepresented or led about. I wish that there was some way to appeal to the moderates. We used to have a country where most people believed that science was a thing, that science is real and you'd be a fool to deny that, but everybody at the same time also had this idea that you have a soul that goes somewhere when you die, right? That was the mainstream person. And we have now polarized, such that recent polls show that more people who reject science outright, and this includes the flat earthers and so, are on the rise. And atheism is on the rise, all 50 states across the country. So how can both of these be on the rise at the same time? We're losing that middle. So we have people that are walking away from religion entirely. We have people who are walking away from science entirely. And it's cutting us down the middle in a very polarized society. I would much rather live with people that held the delusion that they have a soul and they'll go someplace if they're going to be reasonable about science too. But we're losing that. And it's very disturbing to me that I can't get people to notice it. I mean, it's so easy to say, well, he's not a true Christian. No true Scotsman just is their only defense so that they don't have to acknowledge what the hell is going wrong.
Yeah, and I would just say that's not our only defense. So if you watch back the panel discussion last night, you and I probably would have very enjoyable conversations. I am a very strong critic of evangelicalism, to the point where if we meant evangelical in the sense that it meant 60, 70, 80 years ago, I would be an evangelical. If we mean evangelical, what it means now, kind of a political movement, very, very tied to kind of a neoconservative, far-right methodology, I'm not an evangelical. I don't call myself an evangelical. I very strongly oppose the label. I'm very critical of a lot of the ways that it handles politics, it handles engagement. And again, you might disagree with me on certain views. So for example, I give the example of gay marriage. I think the way that the evangelical community has handled gay marriage is atrociously bad. Because we've set it up as an antithesis, it almost comes across as two species that are battling against each other. And I think one of the things that happens, and one of my criticisms of the liberal Christianity is effectively because they don't call something sin, they offer no hope for it. The problem with the right is the exact opposite. The problem with the right says, you're too bad, there's no hope for you. And so there's no more relationship that happens. There's no more kind of that common humanity that happens where the historic Christian confession is that I am the chief of sinners. Who am I to judge any sinner, whether or not they're a believer or not? I am the chief of sinners. I know how bad my heart is. I know that I'm a dog nasty sinner. So who am I to judge you? You know what I'm going to do? I give the example of a gay couple where one of the spouses was passing with cancer. They had adopted a child. I might have certain views about the ethics of that. But what I'm not going to do is spend all my time and all my money sitting there opposing that person. What I am going to do is I'm going to bring them meals, and I'm going to make sure that their child is taken care of. When one of them has to go and be a partner to the other person at the hospital, I'm going to make sure that I sit there and I cry with them and I pray for them and I love them no matter what. Even if I have disagreements about their ethics, I'm not going to try to raise $300 million to support a proposition that simply embattles and oppresses people. Even if I have certain ethical disagreements with their behavior. I could use divorce. While I think divorce is sin, am I raising $300 million in a movement to try to give divorced people a limitation on their rights? No, I'm not going to do that. I am, as a Christian, think that I am called to present loving forgiveness and grace towards people because I recognize that I am the chief of sinners among all people. So I am, one of the things that I appreciate the most, and if you stay through Clinton is going to be talking about bioethics and Christianity, one of the things that I'm most encouraged about, because I'm strongly pro-life, is that there is in that movement, there are secular pro-life, there are atheist pro-life, there are agnostic pro-life, there are Christian pro-life, there are Hindu pro-life. There's a sense where whether or not you agree with plural life or not, it is a sense where there is pluralism in the best possible way, where we can set aside certain disagreements about other things and stand up for the things that we do believe in. The same thing happens in the pro-choice movement. If you want to be on that side, there are Christians that are pro-choice. I think those examples where we can break down some of the polarization and simply say, you know what, we disagree, but we can still act as humans to each other is going to be the most important thing.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
I would like, while I still have everybody here, I would like to schedule, at some point, I just want everybody to hear the invitation, but I want to do, well, you said that there was a number of things that a scientific naturalism could explain it, that would cause you, okay, some of those are fallacious, but which is fine, I can address those too. But then the things that aren't actually do have good explanations. I would like to get on a video with you at some point to discuss all of those.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you guys very much. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you guys. We'll go ahead and break. I'm sure, as I said earlier, for those who may not have been here, Aron Ra has his book for $20. I forget the name of it.
Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism.
Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. It's $20. It's back at the table. There's also some other merchandise for the Mentionables, who were hosting the thing for Defense of the Faith. So again, thank you all very much. We truly appreciate your time and your attention.